The 900th year on the Shoten calendar in the Armos area was an era that the last generation called the Troubled Times. The land was overshadowed by the rule of the great King Armos, who took away the power of all small kingdoms. This time was an era where heroes from all over had competed for superiority, and no one ever stopped fighting, plundering as if they were animals. It was a time when if a person wanted to protect something, they had to survive and win. And on this battlefield, there was a man called Varian de Lioncourt. He stood as a greater king than his ancestors who founded the Lioncourt kingdom. He was a genius of warfare and would forever be recorded and remembered in history. Varian's story was told by many bards who had spread his name across the country. However, those stories never told the truth. No one ever knew the true story of the Great King. The story of the Great King and the soldiers who fought beside him. This story was the recollection of the Great King's wisdom in battle. This was the story of a great king who befell many misfortunes. This was the saga of Lioncourt. There was a man who was being helped by his mother to put armor on his body before he would set off for battle. Being told by a man in the same room how there were 600 allies on his side, while there were 1,400 on Backlord's side. While this sounded challenging, the other man asked the man clad in armor, Varian, if he would agree about it being a suitable first battle. Varian's mother told him to not worry, as she was sure that his grandfather's armor would protect him. And Varian turned to her and said that if he couldn't win it, he wouldn't be able to return alive. Tears ran down his mother's face as she fell to the ground to sob, while he finally set off with a lot on his mind, as he clutched onto his sword with a serious expression. He didn't want and wasn't going to let his family and friends be taken away, and he was going to make sure that he would lead all the enemies to their destined deaths. It was the Shoten year 931, and Varian took out the blade, shouting at all of his allies in the surroundings to let them know that it was time to advance. With this, the first battle of the next King Lioncourt, Varian de Lioncourt, started. But who was Varian and how did he get here? Long ago, he used to be a man called Tanaka Sei, who died when he was 41 years old. He kept falling into nothingness until suddenly his senses finally came back to him being in the middle of being struck with a wooden blade. A young boy was seen falling to the ground as the once dead man held his shoulder while confused about the situation and his surroundings. His eyes widened when he looked around and realized that he was in a completely new world, and it was nothing like the one he had come from, and that he was now in the body of a child. The man with the wooden blade who struck him started to speak and walk toward him, but the reincarnated man realized he couldn't understand the language of this world, and was soon knocked out with the next strike of the blade, his questions never being answered as he fell unconscious. 2 months had passed since that day of reincarnation, and he had come to an understanding about the world. He was training with other young boys, and another boy walked up to Varian asking how he was doing and if he learned anything new. This was Varian's older brother, Roble. Another thing that the reincarnated man learned was that Varian's body was slim, which was why he could easily learn the training fast in the 2 months he had been living in this new world. Roble told the boy to not call him older brother, and just something more casual, before letting Varian know that they should go eat breakfast together. It was fortunate that everyone was still friendly to Varian despite him acting as if he was a completely different and new person, which he was, but everyone thought that he just had amnesia because he hit his head. The food that they had to eat, despite being nobles, was soup, bread, and cheese, which were not the most edible to Varian compared to the world he came from. He just kept trying to push through it since the taste didn't matter much to him, as long as his stomach didn't revolt at the food. Even though it was absolutely a lie, the boy gave a smile and said that he was happy to be able to eat the food. This reaction caused surprise within the older brother, as he ruffled Varian's hair and said that the boy had changed, admitting that he liked the boy more as he was than the previous him, and how everyone else thought that as well. While this was a compliment, the reincarnated man wondered how much of a brat Varian used to be. Roble said that it was time to greet their mother, and Varian asked if the older boy was coming to the church. But Roble told Varian that he wasn't coming since it was boring, so they would see each other later. At the church, everyone sat while listening to the sermon, and Varian was listening intently, since he knew that the religious sect was the group that knew the most about the country, and he wanted to learn as much as he could about this new world, even if he didn't have any interest in the group itself. His mother looked at the boy with confusion since he wondered what happened to the son she used to know, before the supposed amnesia struck. Once the sermon ended, the priest walked up to Varian's mother, Rusciano, and asked if the boy was doing well, to which she said that it was good that he could speak normally at the least. The priest kneeled down to Varian and asked if he was interested in the teachings of Shoten, and Varian eagerly affirmed this, and recited something he had learned while listening in on the sermons. His mother and the priest were shocked at the boy's behavior, and the priest started to ominously talk about how people should stay faithful, as it would bring an understanding between a kid and a parent and prevent a revolt in the world. To which he asked the boy if he could really understand this all at just 7 years old. Mentally, he was 41, but he still continued with being truthful that he could understand it, and was starting to explain what he remembered until the priest got excited from this, and told his mother that Varian was loved by gods, and how his memory loss was a gift from God. Varian realized that he went a bit overboard, since the priest wanted the boy to join the temple, and even the mother was hesitant from this idea. The boy finally spoke and said that he didn't want to become a monk, since he needed to help his brother and his family, causing Reinald to apologize for his behavior. Reinald noticed that the boy seemed to love his brother, and the reincarnated man thought up words to say that would probably lead him on the right path. But those words about how he loved his brother made his mother cry, causing Varian to wonder once again how bad the other Varian used to be. Reinald still wanted to ask if the boy wanted to study with the church since there were a lot of books, and Varian was eager about it, since it would be his chance to learn about the world. Rusciano approved of this, and the boy knew that even if the country didn't have schools, he should still be able to learn about literature and common knowledge from the church. Everyone went home and ate dinner at the table together, and Rudolf, Varian's father, asked how his head was. This man was the same one who hit the boy's head and started this whole thing, to which Varian told him that it was alright, and even if his memories weren't returning, he decided he wanted to study under Reinald. Varian's mother told the father that Reinald was really impressed by Varian's knowledge, and Roble was excited about this as well, wanting to hype up his little brother. The reincarnated male thought about how it seemed as though no one in the family wanted the previous Varian, but learned that the previous Varian could eat without stopping, which was what he did with the food that was on the table. He still wished that he could eat some food from his previous world, but it was too late now. Rudolf grinned at the fact that his son was still the same in his appetite, and Roble joked about his stomach being as big as always despite the memory loss, to which the whole family laughed about together. As Varian sat with his family there, he realized that the previous problem child still seemed to be a person who was still a part of the family. And with that, the man named Tanaka Sei had died, but his life as Varian started here. Since he had died, Varian was going to try his best this time. He would live not as Tanaka Sei, but as Varian. But who was Tanaka Sei? He was a man who thought he had a boring name and lived a normal life, despite dying of unfortunate causes. His family members surrounded him in the hospital in his last days ever since he learned that he had a tumor in his stomach, despite it affecting his body at rapid speeds and was unable to be cured. But Tanaka was glad that the hospital was able to prevent the pain. Tanaka had lived an ordinary life, with the only unordinary thing being that he went to a Buddhist school. He was also forced to join the judo club, and when he was 23, he had a shotgun wedding with his wife, Yumiko, and felt as though he could leave his 2 children to her without worry. He thought that he was happy, but he saw his family crying this much for him and realized that he didn't want to die. He wanted to see his children grow up and see his grandchildren's faces, not even knowing that it was possible for him to die earlier than his parents. He couldn't even live long enough to keep his promise to his wife to go on a certain trip that he wanted to go on with Yumiko. It seemed as though his entire previous life played in his head during his dreams, making the boy wake up in a sweat when he remembered once again that he was reborn as a new person. Varian de Lioncourt. His father, Rudolf, was also the great man known as the Hawk of Lioncourt. Since Varian was under the care of Reinald when it came to his studies, he was learning a lot from the resources they had, and he realized that the world was pretty big. It was similar to his previous one, but he could see some differences, and the priest told him about how they were in a continent called Okaidans, with the Armos kingdom extending to the north and west and surrounded by the mountains in the south and east. With that sort of geography, the boy thought about how it likely helped the kingdom when it came to being protected. Reinald got excited by how easily the boy could understand everything, and Varian thought about how he was getting too far into some paths of his just because he wanted to learn about things despite having too much knowledge as a mentally 41-year-old man in a child's body. Even with the geographical advantage, Reinald said that the monarchy wasn't guaranteed, and there was still a chance that the warlords could revolt. Varian had also learned that there were 360 days in a calendar year, but no water system or glass, making it almost like the medieval ages. The priest asked if the boy had an interest in politics, but Varian said that he was interested in the world, since not remembering anything made him feel uneasy. Reinald scratched his chin, before telling Varian to not worry, since he had enough time in the world to learn, due to being a child, but warned him that if he talked too much, he might forget stuff. At some point, he was called over by a man named Jiro, who was his caretaker and bodyguard, but this man, due to his status, could not read or write, which made Varian believe that the old him was glad to be living within the castle. One of the reasons that he thought this was because the slums were an extremely horrible living environment for people and even animals. The area outside the castle walls was worse than where they stood, and even nobles such as him had to live on straw beds, meaning that getting sick in this kind of environment meant death. While the two walked through this area, Varian turned his head when he heard music, and saw a girl dancing over a bucket with clothes. Realizing that they were washing the laundry with their feet, Jiro realized who Varian was standing at, Rona, and explained that the old him had caused the scar on her forehead and bullied her brother Roro, making Varian shocked before groaning in frustration about the situation. He told Jiro that he wanted to apologize to the girl, but it was unfortunately not possible, since she was a slave child and nobles could not lower their heads to slaves. Varian learned that the world was divided into 4 sections, and while people didn't hurt their slaves, apologizing to them was unheard of. Jiro thought that the boy had fallen in love, but Varian dismissed it, especially since his current body had no desires, and the fact that he was still 41 years old mentally. Rona noticed him and ran away, disappointing the boy as Jiro started to talk about how girls were ew according to past Varian, but could be lured in with even the smallest things, making current Varian think about possibly making a gift for her. He remembered that doing laundry with feet must be rough in the winter, and how no one in Armos used a washing board, so he asked Jiro for a chisel and a wooden board. The man was confused, until he realized the boy was making a gift, causing him to tease Varian, which only confirmed how annoying this man was. After chiseling for a while, Varian realized how hard this was, and knew that this 7-year-old boy's body could not do the job, so he was going to ask Jiro for help later. He still didn't know why he was summoned to this world, but he wanted to make the standard of living better. There was no way he could change the entire world, but he wanted to make the lives of his family and others better, and help the people who raised and supported him. Days later, Rona came to thank Varian for making laundry fun after his gift, making him glad that she liked the washing board that he made, even if most of his work was from Jiro. He was struggling to think how to word what he was going to say, but he ultimately apologized anyway despite his status, making her conflicted, especially when he said that he wanted to become friends. She said that was a waste, and he started to walk away with a disappointed expression, until she explained that she was just hesitant at the idea, since neither she or her brother had friends, and he told her to just call him Varian, since they were now friends. She felt happy about that, and Varian was teased by Jiro as the boy sighed, before trying to tease the older man back, saying that Jiro was just jealous, which only made him laugh and tell the boy that he could have a date with her at the execution. This suggestion was shocking to him, until he remembered that executions were the norm, and were almost used as amusement for the kingdom since not much fun stuff happened. So essentially, executions were like a movie to them. Rona's mother saw that her daughter was using the washing board again, and Rona's brother, Roro, said that it cleaned the clothes well. Their mother asked if the girl was okay with that, since she thought that the girl hated the prince, but Rona said that it didn't matter what she felt due to the statuses. However, even if she thought that she would hate him, she saw the state of his hands when he came with the board. The mother still didn't believe that there was a reason for the change of how Rona felt about the boy, until she learned that Varian did in fact apologize and asked for friendship. They were apparently going to be taught the alphabet that day, and Roro would practice sword fighting with the boy, and their mother wondered how much Varian had changed, but there was nothing she could do about her children's desires, so she let this happen, believing that the friendship wouldn't last long anyway. However, it had now been a month since Varian had become friends with Rona and Roro. He had been teaching them how to read and write while he was learning how to sing from Rona, and practicing swordsmanship with her little brother. During a lesson, Jiro had overpowered Varian, and the boy tried to call upon Roro to do a sneak attack from behind, but Jiro blocked it easily and told Roro to not raise his voice while attacking, as it would give away his position. The older male had also told the boy that swinging a sword didn't matter if he couldn't stab anyone, making him realize that trying to use it like a Japanese sword was probably not the right move. They were about to continue their training, until Rona called them to let them know that the hunters were back since winter was coming, and Jiro left the kids by themselves as they inspected the findings that everyone was going to butcher and preserve. Everyone celebrated, including Rudolph, and people cheered with their drinks while Varian was learning from others about the kinds of things that were eaten during the winter. But they were not taken care of well since people had to sometimes eat rotten meat. He wondered if there were vegetables, and Varian thought about how he would like to try and help people get more vitamins during the winter since that was likely why people were getting sick, but he didn't know how to explain such a new thing. Robel walked up to the boy and said that their father wanted to talk, and by talk, he meant a scolding, since he had finally found out that Varian was teaching slaves how to write and wield blades. Varian had prepared an excuse for this, and said that he was forgiven by them and wanted to teach the children things he had learned from the church in order to make friends and exchange knowledge. But his mother was worried about Varian getting into a relationship with Rona. He reassured her that he had no intent on marrying the girl, and was still aware of their statuses, but he had admitted that he had a dream while studying at the church and needed 1,000 people to make that happen. His father was interested to hear about it, and learned that his son wanted to make a land where everyone could live cleanly and healthily, but Rudolph tried to say that giving slaves knowledge would make them disobey. However, Varian wanted to go further and give them swords. His father laughed and thought that it was time to turn Varian to Lioncourt and learn something from the battlefield. These heavy thoughts settled in everyone's hearts as winter arrived, and Varian wondered if he made the right choice. The winter was harsh, and many people died from the freezing temperature or lack of food. But those who lived in better conditions always had fires lit in their homes. He thought about how things could be better for people if they had chimneys, and remembered something he built with his kids once, it having a simple structure that would provide a great deal of warmth through radiation. However, it wouldn't be easy to set up since he was still a child with a lack of money and connections, so he was going to have to set the idea aside for later. Varian then realized that he was being called on, and the girl said that she wanted to show him what she had promised the other day, that being the white beet. Roro noticed that the two had been holding hands for a long time, which made the little girl flustered. But Varian didn't mind, even though Rona definitely did seem to be affected by the action, as she glared at her brother who mentioned how she was red. She changed the subject and made the boy try some white beet soup, which he immediately hated, but made him realize that they were sugar beets, and would add money to his wallet in the future. But that future would be a long time from now, as he remembered that he heard that he was going back to their territory in the spring, making Rona feel sad at the thought, as she walked over to the crowd and started to sing with a bittersweet tone to it to show her feelings over the situation. The people of Armos loved singing praises of life, and Varian also didn't wish to part, even if he wasn't able to reciprocate the feelings that she definitely had for him. He also sang along with the girl and thought about teaching her some simple calculations, just in case it would help even a little when she married into a family. Once they were done with the song, they were cheered, but Varian was not able to see the girl's expression. Spring finally came and it was time to leave the capital. Reinl said his goodbyes to the boy, and Rudolph told Roro that there was a person he was giving to him, making the boy look at what he was talking about as he realized that the person was Roro. They set off for Lioncourt territory, as Jiro explained that Roro had persisted in becoming Varian's property, and Roro, in a formal manner that he learned from the prince, said that he was going on behalf of his sister, since she couldn't come due to being a girl. Jiro looked out the window and noticed that very girl they were talking about, and everyone could see her waving them goodbye, to which Varian yelled out that he would see her again. It would probably be a long time though, since the 3-week distance to the territory they were going to meant an almost final farewell in this world, and this action of Rona was the best goodbye she could give, as Roro whispered to himself while hoping his sister would take care. A couple weeks after leaving the capital, the brothers were playing board games that he had taught the household, and his brother was impressed by the intelligence of the boy. Robel was also impressed by the speech at the banquet, and Varian wondered if his brother suspected that he was aiming for the position of the family head. So he tried to compliment the older boy and reassure his older brother, since Varian had no interest in being a part of the inheritance. Their parents were in the carriage, and Rusciano told Rudolph that the household would be solidified with the things that the sons were doing, making the father hum in thought. The following week they finally arrived, and it was time for Jiro to leave his position as Varian's guardian, since he was going to be married. Varian held up a hand to shake with the older man, calling him a friend, which made Jiro cry and tell everyone else about how he and the prince were friends. Rudolph walked up to them and said that he was leaving Varian to a man named Albert de Groot, who was explained to be the family butler. By butler, Varian would think of someone in a suit who was attractive and proper, but this man did not seem like that at all, and looked more like a killer. They introduced themselves to each other, and Albert said that he would train the boy from this moment on, to which Varian was about to respond until he was suddenly punched and sent to the ground bleeding. The boy was confused as Albert repeated his words, making this the true first day that Tanaka Sei was rebirthed into Varian, from this man who would change his way of life in the world. Albert's special training was so severe that it completely destroyed Varian's modern values, and this old man made them even kill animals, saying it was practice. A wild dog lunged at Varian and brought him to the ground while biting at the handle of his axe that was currently protecting the boy, making him worried about what to do since getting bit would be bad. Roro jumped in and stabbed the dog with his spear, but nothing they were doing was satisfactory to the old man watching them. He told them that if they didn't kill their target, they were going to die instead. The bleeding animal walked away before turning back with a glare in its eyes, and the two boys charged at the wild animal, deciding to let Roro distract it, while Varian would launch a surprise attack in the side. However, it seemed to still be too shallow to Albert. Varian and Roro were cheering for their kill, but Albert repeated that he told them to kill, and they were confused until Varian realized the dog was still alive and was about to bite Roro, until another boy came in and took the kill. Albert walked up and asked the boy Jean what he was doing, as he just said that he was surveying the battlefield. This boy was Albert's grandchild and seemed to be the exact opposite of Albert, stuck with them as a classmate, but would later become a comrade who shared their destiny. Even after Jean joined with them, it was still the same. They had to continuously kill animals every single day until the day arrived when something was different, a day of commemoration that Varian would never forget. The day that Albert brought out 4 real human beings that the boys would have to kill. Varian stared with confusion and shock as the old man repeated that he was telling them to kill these people, but the noble boy wanted to know who these people were first. This was only responded to with a whack in the face that caused another nosebleed. But Varian continued with the same question and learned that the people were one sick slave and the rest were criminals. It was one thing to kill criminals, but the boy didn't see a reason to kill a slave for being sick. The woman was coughing to herself as she muttered for the boy to help her, but Varian had to make a choice as the knife was handed to him. Roro offered to do the job for him, and Varian remembered that this world was different than his previous, and that he had no choice but to earn military achievements. With a heavy heart, he stabbed the crying woman in the chest, and she moved away while screaming for him not to kill her. Albert yelled at the frozen boy that she wasn't dead yet, and with a shout, he finally gained the resolve to push through the action and continuously stab the woman despite her screams, while Albert praised the boy in the background. It was a cruel death through blood loss, and Varian, who had lived a life of 42 years, had killed a person for the first time. The old man told the boy to properly think about where to stab next time, before ordering the other 2 boys to beat the rest of the people to death with clubs, saying that they didn't need to hold back since they were only criminals. Behind Varian's trembling back, Roro and Jean continued, and the men gave pained screams before their training that day would end, before the woman's blood on his hands dried. They were taken back to their territory, and Varian was talking with his older brother about what he had done, to which Robel told Varian that there was no need to get upset over a situation like that, as they were only simply a slave and criminals. Varian was surprised that his older brother could say this, until Robel explained that he himself didn't think that this was okay either, and was just something that they had to get used to. There were no comforting words to say, but Robel wanted his little brother to remember that even if he was used to killing, he should never turn into a person that got pleasure from it. The previous him seemed like the kind to do so, but the current him made Robel believe that he would be alright. In truth, Varian wanted to run away from this feeling of guilt, but what his older brother said was right. The boys continued killing and would eventually become more and more skillful, losing any reluctance towards the actions they were doing. They were expected to become beasts, since it was a period where people were more beast than human. This was an era of conflict where beasts killed each other, and now the second winter had passed, and Varian had turned 9 years old. Albert had taken the boys into a forest near a place where there were some pigs grazing along with shepherds and dogs watching the animals, to which the old man told them to steal the pigs. They were currently in Viscount Bachelord's territory, since the Lioncourt territory was on bad terms with them, and was harassing them while calling it training. Albert said that killing and pillaging were a knight's duty, making Varian's sweat drop, since this was not the same chivalrous behavior that the knights he used to know did. He wondered if it would be okay to drive away the shepherds and then steal the pigs, but Roro said that it would be a problem if they were reported, so he suggested that they kill them, which made Albert smile at the suggestion. It was true that if they were caught, they would get the death sentence immediately, even if Varian was a noble. Jean and Roro continued their discussion, and Varian sighed at the fact that children who were barely 10 were joyfully planning an attack. But this was how the world was. Varian spoke up and told the other 2 that it was a bad idea to be scattered, since the shepherds were likely to be carrying weapons. But there was also no point in getting injured or dying. So after a bit of planning, they finally decided on just pretending that they were asking for the help of the shepherds, since they were only children in the eyes of these adults. The shepherds bought into the lie, and it was time to strike, and Roro immediately stabbed the man in the heart before Jean shot the woman in the throat with an arrow, while they tried to finish off the dogs. This should have been a simple operation, but something just had to go wrong, and Jean realized that one of the dogs had gotten away. Varian ordered Jean to hide the bodies while Roro and he would catch the pigs and run after setting the forest on fire. After everyone had returned and were having dinner with the pig they had stolen, Jiro and Varian were able to talk with each other once again. The event that was about to occur would be later recounted as a famous tale, and this was also the time that Varian had met Jiro's father, Yannick, who held a very familiar resemblance, as Varian realized that this man was Albert's brother. Coincidentally, Albert had popped in and asked if the dirty animals had gathered together, seemingly joking around by saying that he would massacre them. and Yannick said that it seemed as though Albert wanted his right ear burned off too. Somehow, the joking tone had turned intense, as both of the older men glared at each other, ready to fight. Varian tried to jump in and tell Albert to stop, since Yannick was his friend's father, saying that he would insult Albert's honor. Albert was curious what the boy would do until Varian gave him the middle finger and told him insults he knew from his previous life, immediately getting smacked into the table. This was only part of Varian's plan, though, since he was hoping and expecting such a phrase to be universal no matter the world. And so a brawl broke out in the building while Varian slipped out of consciousness. When he awoke, everyone was down except for Albert and his father, who offered the boy some mead that was surprisingly delicious to him, causing the other two to laugh. Albert told Rudolph that his son was going to take over all of Lioncourt, but the father believed that both of his sons were equal in their ability to take the territory, making Albert chuckle at how doting Rudolph was as a parent. The both of them were still impressed at how intense the boy made the situation with the phrase and action he said, causing him to think that he handled it correctly, especially since this phrase would become a regular insult in the household. Winter came and everyone got used to killing, so they were training against each other in hand-to-hand combat. However, Varian had an advantage since he had already gotten a black belt in judo in his previous life. Jean was shocked by being beaten that easily, and Albert told the other two boys to follow Varian's example, making Varian feel a little bit bad about how unfair the situation seemed. Roro and Jean walked off somewhere, confusing Varian, as he was reminded of the time that he and his family went to Guam together. Could he someday have those happy days again in a world like this? All he knew was that he had to get stronger to never lose something again. Several weeks later, Varian was surprised by how much better Roro and Jean had gotten at using a shield and bow, to which they explained that they were undergoing special training in order to complement the other, according to Albert's suggestion. The old man said that comrades were people who didn't need to be the same, and Varian realized that it was important for the sake of protecting to become stronger while complementing each other. That was their strength that would resist the world. Later, Varian asked his mother if a person named Katja was coming, to which the woman confirmed since Rudolph was discussing things with Giselle, Katja's mother and Rudolph's lover, and Hughes, Katja's brother. He met with the little girl and tried to get her to be less formal since they were family, so he suggested a game for them to play, and Rudolph ended the meeting and saw them having fun together. Giselle told the girl to not bother the boy or call him casual nicknames, but Varian said that it was fine, and made a joke about how his father couldn't give him a little sister even if he asked for one, which earned him a whack on the head. The mistress's family was called because his brother Hughes had to succeed the family name of a dead branch family, Brawl, and proceeded to leave the state. Rudolph told the boy that they were all siblings by blood, and if Varian needed anything, he could ask Hughes for help, something he told the boy since Roble didn't like Giselle and the others for some reason. Varian said that it would make men pass his test if they wanted to be Katja's husband, but his father told him to not be too considerate. The father was about to say something else but decided to dismiss it, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder as Varian understood what he wanted to say, since he was a father before as well. This man was definitely Varian's father, something he could feel from the warmth in Rudolph's hand. Summer came and Varian noticed that he was finally going through his second growth spurt. Looking out the window, he remembered that the day was Roble's investiture ceremony. Everyone seemed excited at the sight of the older brother clad in armor, and Rudolph walked up to him to recite their teaching, which Roble affirmed that he would try to follow. Suddenly, he was punched in the face, which was a sign of bestowing knighthood, and to make sure that the knight didn't forget his oath. Rudolph gave Roble the sword and told him to show his courage, and Roble proceeded to shout in front of the crowd with the blade raised high. Varian started to cry because he himself wanted to see his children grow up to be adults, but that was too late now. The ceremony held competitions to celebrate, and Varian competed in wrestling due to his past life skills, but no one seemed to have faith in him because he only looked and physically was a child. Varian told the match announcer that it was fine and they began the fight, and within seconds, the large man was down on the ground unconscious. Everyone was shocked and this man tried to insist that he should try it again, to which Varian asked if he was going to say the same on the battlefield, causing the man to have to withdraw with shame. Most people would think that the opponent slipped, but this was not the end of his wrestling competition, as the next person was a man named Enzo, a friend of Roble. The fight began and Varian realized that he couldn't compete with this man when it came to physical strength, but that same strength would be his downfall, as Varian quickly suplexed the taller male and threw him to the ground. Another win for Varian, and he said that it was a victory for his brother, with his next one going to be dedicated to his younger sister. The third person was a giant compared to the small boy, and it turned out that this old man was going to try to crush him with his weight. But Varian had a plan up his sleeve, as he brought up his body, making his family worried, until the boy wrapped his legs around the large man's neck. People realized he was strangling the larger male, confused why the male wasn't shaking off the boy. But Varian was compressing a certain artery that would quickly make a person lose consciousness and fall. Another win for Varian, and everyone started to chant for the boy while his older brother and father wondered where he learned those techniques. He won 2 more matches but finally lost one, so he was going to have to get more stamina later. Afterwards, people would start exaggerating about what happened, and young people started to desire his friendship, even if most of them were supposedly scared of Albert. But there seemed to be one girl who was watching intently, as Varian's story continued into spring at 11 years old. Spring came and the capital issued the family to mobilize their military forces, since an uprising occurred in the Purgers territory, which is to the southwest of the Lioncourt territory. Participating in military battles at a young age was considered a valiant act, and the others wanted to join even if they had to wait until they were older. A girl walked up to them and introduced herself as Smyrna Korkus, and talked about how she was impressed to see the boy defeat adults, saying it left a deep impression on her. But Varian knew what she was there for and coldly brushed her off before leaving. Jean said it was a waste and wondered if he should go after that girl, but Roro said it was pointless, since Varian needed a partner who wouldn't tarnish the family name. The blonde boy teased Roro by asking if he had the right to say that when he was going out with a commoner, making Roro flustered and feign confusion, and he felt more a part of this world as summer arrived and the battle that his family supported was over. The one who led the soldiers home was his uncle, Roderick, but the uncle noticed a red hand mark on his face and asked about it, as Varian remembered what had caused it to appear. Earlier, Varian was trying to talk with Roro and remembered that a girl named Millet had come to visit, making him wonder if they were doing things together. That was immediately confirmed when Varian put his ear to the door and heard them having their fun, making him feel conflicted from the desires that his 11-year-old body was having. He needed to do something about it and remembered Smyrna from long before, deciding to run up to her and pull her away behind a building. She was confused until he suddenly said that he liked her and kissed her, and he was trying to do more until she finally gained the courage to slap him in the face and run away, crying and calling him the worst. It was something that he should have expected after how he treated her, but things would start to get out of hand due to rumors being spread, and these rumors finally reached his mother, Rusciano. His mother severely scolded him for how he approached an unmarried woman like Smyrna, but he knew how to deal with these sorts of situations and tried to appeal to Rusciano's motherhood while avoiding bad excuses. However, this seemed to lead to his mother suggesting that he should beg for the head of the Korkus family for punishment, since he was a man who needed to take responsibility. He reluctantly agreed to do so, but this seemed to mean that he was going to end up marrying the girl. Varian went to the household and lowered his head in front of him, making the father feel overwhelmed by the situation, as Varian begged for punishment like his mother told him to. The girl asked him why he was doing this, and he admitted that he was unable to control himself every time he saw her, and was turned into a dishonest fool. Yorgo, Smyrna's father, became excited at the implication, and he, along with his son, wanted Smyrna to forgive Varian. With a sigh, she told the boy to raise his head, and she smiled at him, since they were now a parent-approved couple. Years later, the two were seen walking together through the land as their relationship had begun progressing smoothly. They sat at the tree to rest despite all of the responsibilities they had, and Varian said that he was tired after helping set up his brother's marriage. Roble married a lovely girl named Floria, who was the daughter of a knight, but she still lost to Smyrna. He also wondered how Rona was doing after hearing that she had gotten married as well, making him have mixed feelings about the situation. Smyrna was staring at him, bringing him back to reality, as she said that she just had a feeling that he was thinking about other girls. Even in another world, a woman's intuition was not something to make light of. Their faces got closer, and Varian asked if she wanted to do it there, which she was hesitant about, but they went through with it. Recently, there were times when his memories as Tanaka and Varian had become ambiguous, and he started to think that the idea of growing old with Smyrna wasn't that bad. As they rode home, Roro ran up to the male with a worried expression as he told Varian that the bachelored Viscount had sent a declaration of war to them. Varian hurried back and learned that there was a rebellion from Matthias, the Crown Prince's younger brother, and how Matthias had 2,000 troops heading for the capital, but their territory only had 600 soldiers remaining due to the prevalence of fevers from winter till spring. They gave out a warning to stay away from infected people, but it was too hard to explain, and he had no power to mandate hand washing, along with the fact that the development of soap was also a failure. Albert asked if Varian was listening, and the male asked if this all meant that they were the only ones who could protect the place, to which the old man said that they would dominate the enemy. The others got excited to fight, everyone including a recent addition of Smyrna's older brother, Andre. Varian's items from the blacksmith arrived, and they were all armor used in real battles that he knew from his previous life. Stuff like low-cost helmets that could be worn over a leather cap, and baskets that could hold food for a couple of days. There were other such armors, but Andre asked about a certain one that Varian put on and had an effect of intimidation, making everyone even more hyped about overtaking the enemy. Varian's mother walked in and told him to follow her to the armory, as she showed him armor that was used by his grandfather, which he put on without hesitation, and with the help of his mother. She said that he needed to grow as big as he could, and teared up at the sight of him in the armor, saying that she was sure his grandfather would protect him on the battlefield. Varian, clad in his grandfather's armor, set off for his first battle, while his mother prayed to their god to protect her son. They marched to the fortress city of Porto on the border, where they were going to engage with the Bachelord's forces. 2 days later, Varian met up with his uncle, who was shocked at the sight of the boy, as Roderick thought he was seeing his father because of the armor and helmet. It was corrected that it was Varian, and he said that he received the armor from his mother before getting interrupted by Jiro's father, Yannick, who Varian had not seen since the time he was 9. Yannick joked that Albert must be feeling disappointed that he was made to stay and defend the capital, but it was not a surprise since Yannick himself had come to assist. Whether that was true or merely just a saying of confidence, who knows? Varian said he was grateful for the old man to come and help and felt reassured, but he was not the only familiar man who would assist in the battle. There also came Varian's half-brother, Hughes, who reached out his hand to shake, as they both looked forward to working with each other. The next morning on the battlefield, the Bachelord army had approximately 1,400 people, with the Lioncourt side being only 600 men strong. Uncle Roderick was the supreme commander of the army and was soon going to give the signal to start the battle. He shouted loudly at his allies, telling them that those of the Lioncourt feared nothing, and those of the Bachelord were just men who had come to steal their wives in their absence. Their only priority was to cut off their heads and feed them to the pigs. But the feudal lord of the Viscounty, Eustace, did not seem to enjoy these words, shouting out about how he was never going to forget how the Lioncourt were the ones who came to steal and destroy his lands countless times in the past. Varian was watching closely at the exchange of insults, being reminded of Albert, until his thoughts were interrupted by Andre walking up to Varian and saying that Smyrna wanted to deliver something. This something turned out to be her underwear, which confused Varian as he proceeded to sniff it, causing the other men to snicker and laugh at the sight. Andre continued and explained that Smyrna wanted him to know that he better not lose the war, making Varian realize that this was the woman's way of lending support. Suddenly, it was time for the battle to start, and Roderick shouted at the others to raise their voices, to which all the men started giving battle cries in sync. Even if the Lioncourt had fewer weapons and men, even if they could not engage in a siege, if they lost, their men would be enslaved and their women would be taken away to do unspeakable things. Eustace and Roderick both yelled for all their units to advance, and that they did. Everyone charged forward with determination and a thirst for blood. Shouts were heard all throughout the battlefield and hundreds of arrows were shot from the Bachelord's side, to which Rollo let the others know to protect their shields from the incoming attack. They stood still and let their shields take the hit, making the enemy think that the Lioncourt were stupid for their decisions, as they charged at them once again. What they didn't know was that there was someone hiding behind the wall of shields, or rather, someone. Varian held a grin as he indirectly told the men of the Bachelor to do what they were going to do if they really had the guts. Out came Varian from the wall of shields, who plunged his blade into the head of one of the spearmen, shouting at the others to not let the enemy get too close and to prioritize with crushing them. Spears flew through the sky, and everyone either protected themselves with the shields or unfortunately got hit. But Varian himself had one of the spears graze his shield and break it, which left him in the open range of the spears. A man was lunging at him with a long blade, and the dark-haired male knew that the situation was bad, since he had no way of repelling it. However, an arrow flew into this man's head and killed him. Varian's savior was Jean, who winked at the male, as Varian told the archer that he owed him one, proceeding to charge into the battle once again. This was the 931st year of the Shoten calendar. This bloody battle, later recorded as the Great Battle of Porto, would tell the tale of the legendary king who would soon build his own kingdom. The tale of Varian de Lioncourt's first battle. He was going to make them regret thinking it was so easy to rob them, or thinking that they could trample the men of Lioncourt. At the Bachelord's camp, Eustace was having fun with 2 women, until he was interrupted by a messenger who was telling him that the battle had only just begun. Eustace stood up and asked what an army of 600 farmers could accomplish with no excellent leaders, and the messenger tried to say that they didn't expect the Lioncourt to have such high morale, but he was about to reassure the Viscount until Eustace had sliced off the top of his head, claiming that it was a dull answer. He picked up the piece that was cut off and started preaching about how he was not going to accept anything but victory, throwing the half of the head into one of the woman's laps. He wanted his men to gather the heads of the Lioncourt and display them for all to see, as they traveled towards the capital in order to try and strike fear into the other side. Eustace started to laugh maniacally at the thought of it. and wanted all of his men to just have the priority of eliminating every single one of the Lion Corps without an ounce of mercy. Roderick was surrounded, but he was still holding his own and fought against many of the men, despite being extremely exhausted. He was about to get stabbed in the back, until someone came to the rescue to slice that enemy in half, the savior being Yannick. They smiled at each other after a joke, but they still had to focus on the battle ahead of them, preparing to fight once again while they both said that the fun had yet to end. Meanwhile, Rollo and Jean were still fighting together, and the blonde boy was starting to curse under his breath, when he started to realize that he didn't have enough arrows. Rollo chuckled and told Jean that there were weapons to use other than the bow, and that he would understand once he saw that in action. A sword was a weapon that was commonly taught to be used for stabbing, but that would not be the case when fighting against many opponents at once. However, on the other hand, it would be unwise for the wielder to swing it recklessly, as not even a skilled soldier could take down a riotous lunatic easily. Similarly, when one was surrounded from all four directions, engaging one's enemy in a melee would restrict their movements and force them to be more cautious in order to not injure their own during the struggle. Reducing the number of one's enemies would only aid one to strike as one pleases without having to worry about any hindrances. Varian's blade connected with the shield of one of the Bachelord's forces, but it did not seem to break through, causing Varian to repeatedly slash at the shield, until it would eventually shatter and give the opportunity for Varian's sword to slice through the man's head. Unfortunately, his blade broke during that slash, and another enemy force was charging in behind Varian, so Varian decided to plunge his broken blade into the man's throat. Suddenly, he felt something in his side, and saw that someone was trying to pierce a dagger into him, but it didn't seem to work due to the armor he was wearing. He proceeded to turn around and throw the man to the ground, breaking his neck. The enemy was shocked by this ominous aura that Varian was starting to give, and Rollo and Jean were shocked as well, feeling impressed by the actions of the man. Varian picked up one of the weapons of the enemies that he had already killed, and with sweat and a heavy breath asked who was next. His aura became even more intimidating as he shouted at all those who wished to die to come at him, and saying he would slay all who approached. The entirety of the enemy forces of the Bachelord's side started to shake in fear at the sight of Varian, who was ready to kill all of them. Varian awoke in his house from his previous life and thought that his entire life as a Lion Corps was just a dream, getting up and walking down the hall to the bathroom with a groan of pain since he felt his stomach hurting. He didn't feel good and thought about possibly taking a shower to make him feel better, but when he lifted his head to look in the mirror, he immediately saw his otherworld self. This made the dark-haired male shout in surprise and fall to the ground, suddenly realizing that they were now in a void of darkness with just the two of them. Varian's otherworld self asked his old self who he was, but his old self only stayed confused and thought that he was likely being haunted by a ghost. Varian continued to ask his old self who he was again and again, as his old self tried to say that he was just himself, about to say his name, until he realized he couldn't remember it. Who was he? Back in reality, Varian had taken off the head of one of the enemies with his long club, and the corpse fell to the ground while everyone else was bewildered by the strength of the man. The dark-haired male continued killing many of the men and sent one flying into a group of the enemy forces, sending them to the ground as Varian smashed his weapon into their bodies, letting the blood spill everywhere. In his thoughts, Varian was wondering why all of these people were so weak, starting to laugh at the thought of being way stronger than them, and easily being able to sweep through the forces as if they were just prey for him to hunt. He started to laugh in enjoyment at his actions, wanting his enemies to run and scream in fear while they would entertain him with their cries of despair. Suddenly, the memory of his brother Robert, telling him to not turn into a person who got pleasure from killing, flashed in his mind, and he suddenly stopped moving for just a moment. Rollo shouted at him in worry as arrows were shot his way, and he was completely brought back into reality when he realized what almost happened to him. The enemies tried to charge at him again, thinking they had an opportunity, but he immediately grabbed the wrist of one of the men and suplexed and was about to get pierced by the spear of the other man until Rollo came to the rescue to kill the incoming man. He asked if Varian was okay, and Varian explained that he was fine since the armor helped to make the wounds shallow, but Rollo still reprimanded him for standing still on the battlefield since it was inexcusable. Jean chimed in and said that he didn't want him killed in their first battle, making Varian sweat drop at being scolded by the both of them. There was one more thing that Rollo wanted to tell Varian, and that was a reminder to Varian that he bore the lives of all the soldiers from the Earldom of Lioncourt, and how he should not overindulge in his own strength, as that would be the most foolish. They smiled at each other when Varian knew that Rollo was able to notice what Varian was thinking in that moment of pause that he had on the battlefield, and felt glad to have such an irreplaceable friend as Rollo. Jean shot at some of the enemy, and said that it was unlikely for the enemy to surrender even after witnessing Varian's strength, so he shouldn't get carried away. But Andre entered the conversation and said that Jean would have died 3 times if he wasn't around. The blonde boy tried to deny that, But regardless of what happened, Varian, Rollo, Andre, and Jean were going to work well together by complementing one another's weaknesses. As long as they had their comrades, as long as they remained united, they could win this battle against Eustace. Eustace was impressed that Varian and the others had such confidence to think that they could win just because they were able to withstand wave after wave of enemy soldiers. But he seemed to grin, implying that he still had some tricks up his sleeve. Rollo was telling the dark-haired male that their allies were getting overwhelmed, so Varian charged in to pick up a spear and threw it at the enemy forces and saved one of their allies. They told this man to follow them as the enemy was going to attack from behind, and everyone quickly made their way to another part of the battlefield as Varian seemed to notice something in the distance. Eustace watched from afar, thinking about how the army he formed was specifically made to crush Rudolph and his men, and grinned when he watched the shock on everyone's faces when hundreds more enemies started to run at them. The Viscount knew that his army of 1,400 men was truly going to be a test of endurance, since the true challenge was only beginning. People started to charge at the Lioncourt forces, and Varian's allies started to fall one by one, as Rollo worriedly told the dark-haired male that the Bachelord's men had broken through their center. Varian was starting to wonder if the information the scout provided was wrong, but there could have been no way the enemy had so many additional soldiers. He realized that Eustace just kept a portion of his army in reserves from the beginning, in order to ensure victory against Varian's father, cursing under his breath as he realized that they had also underestimated the enemy. Rollo was trying to hold off against the new waves of men, and tried to tell Varian that there were too many of them, until he was interrupted by one of the enemy sending an axe to his head, and his helmet broke. Varian shouted in worry and dashed forward to knock out the man and check up on Rollo, but Rollo weakly told Varian that it was okay, since he was a shield for Varian. The dark-haired male knew that the wound was deep, which meant immediate medical attention was necessary, but the others told Varian that he needed to worry about himself. Varian's thoughts were racing as he didn't know what to do, but unfortunately the decision was already made, as the sound of a horn signaled for the retreat of Lioncourt. They struggled to survive, but they had to drag their feet away in defeat in the end, making the Bachelord army not pursue them due to their victory. At the Lioncourt army's camp, people were getting patched up or resting, but Yannick shouted at everyone to prepare for an ambush, as the enemy could attack at any moment. Rollo was patched up and apologized for not being useful, but Varian said that there was no need to cry over such a thing. Jean went to treat the injuries of Varian, and started to pluck out the arrowheads in his torso, making Varian yelp in pain from how the action felt, which caused the blonde boy to tease Varian for his behavior. All the men around started to laugh at the sight, and Varian felt better knowing that everyone was able to laugh after a defeat, as it meant that they still had the guts to keep fighting. The man that Varian had saved earlier suddenly bowed before him and insisted on becoming a shield for Varian, but Varian said that there was no need for sacrifices, as they were going to emerge victorious in this battle. The others wondered what he meant by that, as Varian explained that they were going to be the ones to ambush the Bachelord's forces that night. Roderick was shocked by this suggestion as well and thought that it was reckless, since it was unfamiliar territory. But Varian tried to insist that it was not so unfamiliar, since Albert had led them through the terrain before. Hughes stared in silence, as Yannick wondered if this meant to strike the enemy in the dark. But Varian explained that he meant he was going to set the forests and villages ablaze to lessen the forces of the army for a period of time. This plan was effective in eliminating the enemy's source of food, along with them trying to find any potential traitors in their army to weed out any impediments to their plans. Burning down the villages would deal a blow to their economy, which was something Varian was aware of, and knew that this was not a type of strategy that would be devised before. But Hughes seemed against such cowardly tactics. Varian tried to explain that they were not going to win if they fought fair, but Varian's half-brother angrily asked if Varian was afraid of the enemy, to which he stepped forward and affirmed that was the case. He admitted that he only cared about the lives of those in Lioncourt, and did not care about those in enemy territory, and Hughes had the same opinion but felt that they shouldn't fight without pride. Varian said that their people would not understand why someone would sacrifice themselves for their pride, and asked the other male if he told his own family to die honorably for their land when he left. But Varian knew that Hughes didn't do so, as he likely just said something about protecting them. Varian asked for Roderick to gather 10 men for them, and would be back within 2 days for a good result to show everyone on their side. But Varian knew that Hughes wasn't fully convinced of their decision to stop fighting honorably from now on. At midnight, they left camp and carefully made their way to enemy territory to start their one-sided bloody massacre. Varian sliced off the head of a man of a couple, while the woman would scream and cry in despair, before being sliced as well. Suddenly, the child of the couple walked into the room with confusion and fear, and the presence of this child made Varian hesitate in his steps, before he finally went through and killed the child as well. He cursed under his breath as he was angry at himself, when he realized that the memories of his past life were getting in the way. But his thoughts were interrupted by Jean walking in with a torch to tell him to not feel guilty, as this was the right thing to do. They set everything ablaze and continued with the raids, mercilessly killing people and ruining everything to make sure these places would become deserted. Later, Varian learned about all the resources and loot that his men had gotten because of their raids. But it was good that they could be compensated for their dirty jobs and still get as many resources as they could get. One of their men walked up to Varian and said that some of the villagers had escaped, but the dark-haired male said that it was all according to plan, as the escapees would spread the word. And with that, the morale of their side was raised with every raid, and he knew that these men would be loyal to him as long as he satisfied their desires, even after this one battle. But that was until later. 2 days later, Roderick felt content with everything that Varian had been doing, as the enemy's morale had been reduced as well. Hughes reluctantly acknowledged Varian's suggestion, and Roderick was already excited and wanted to know what was next, as Varian said that they should strike, while they could not give the enemy time to recover. He knew that his uncle was concerned by this suggestion, but Yannick chimed in and agreed that this was the best time to attack, making Roderick feel as though he had to agree as well. Varian was still glad to have his uncle as a leader of their forces, even if he wasn't very talented in the military arts. But there were more important things than military talent. All that was left for them now was to steel themselves and respond in kind. As Eustace sat in his camp, he heard the reporting about the things that Varian was doing to their side of the battle, making the Viscount stand up to tell the messenger to stop talking and just send a unit out at once to strike back. Suddenly, another person came into the tent to tell him that one of their knights had formed a company with 100 of his own men, and intended to focus on making up for the burning settlements. With everything that was being reported, Eustace was starting to panic, and told everyone to silence while he thought about what was happening. He didn't believe that it was Rudolph's brother who was making all of this happen, and it was unlikely for it to be Rudolph himself considering they were cheap ploys. So Eustace was only left in confusion about who could have possibly planted the ideas that would start to make his men crumble. Meanwhile, Varian was standing in front of all of their men, and Roderick suggested that it would be best for Varian to give a speech instead of the commander, surprising the dark-haired male, as Roderick explained that everyone already wished to hear his words after he had done so much for them by cutting down many enemies during their previous skirmish. Varian knew that it would bring disappointment if he refused, so he had to raise their morale somehow, deciding on something short and harsh. Immediately shouting at everyone, he called for their attention, and they all started to roar in affirmation as he told them that the enemies were only pathetic pieces of meat for them to prey on, and that he would lead them through this hunt to a feast beyond their comprehension. Now it was time to attack. Eustace could hear the roars of the Lion Corps forces and started to panic even more, even though he was still confident that he could win against such trivial tactics. The Viscount called for his horse as he was going to lead his own men against the Lion Corps to slaughter them himself, and both forces charged at each other while Varian ran in front of his men. He remembered that Albert had told him that the commander should lead the vanguard, and that even if there were few cases where armies had won with their vanguards crushed, he should still try to destroy as much of the enemy before they would break through their own forces. No matter what would come at them, Varian was not going to stop, since it was his job to rally everyone, while knowing that the Bachelord soldiers would be unwilling to die after tasting victory in the first battle. The fact that they withdrew during the second battle due to worry was proof of the fact, and this sudden ambush with the high morale of the Lion Corps would definitely make the Bachelord's forces terrified at the sight of the bloodthirsty men, who were all unafraid of death, and charging through their masses. Everyone continued their battle cries until Varian had a large man lunge at him and bring him to the ground without a weapon to protect himself, and the man tried to stab at the dark-haired male. However, Varian did all that he could to move his body and was able to prevent the blade from slicing him. The man complained about the movement and was about to try again, until the man that Varian saved from earlier had wrapped his body around the large man to distract him, giving an opportunity for Rollo to slice through the man, killing him. Varian thanked them both, even though Rollo complained that he was too far ahead of the forces, since they were worried about the dangers. But Varian insisted that this was normal, and it would destroy them if they let this chance slip. Yannick agreed and quickly used his axe against many of the enemy men, while saying that this was their only chance to strike, since the Bachelord soldiers were panicked and confused. The older male told Varian to look, as the man on the horse in the distance was the Viscount himself, Eustace, who hardly ever showed his face. Yannick said that he should have stayed in hiding this time as well, but this only helped their ambush, and Yannick said that he was going to clear the way for Varian to charge forward and try to destroy Eustace. The men of the Bachelor territory were being killed left and right and were starting to become scared of what was going to become of them, so they all decided that it would be best if they would run away, since all of them were too afraid of death to truly fight and win against the forces of the Lion Corps. Varian's blade plunged through one of the men's heads, and the roars of the Lion Corps men were heard throughout the battlefield, as Eustace was starting to see all of his men run past him in fear, making him panic even more, as he shouted at them in anger at their decision to try and flee. He tried to get the attention of his men and even sliced through one of them, as the soldiers tried to get forgiveness from the old man, as they explained that they needed to retreat, but Eustace told them to advance with spears at the ready. The men seemed hesitant about doing such a thing, since they were too afraid of Varian, who seemed like a demon to them, relentlessly killing everything in his path. Varian and Yannick both were swiftly making their way through the forces with grins on their faces, as they joked about whether they would keep up with one another. The Bachelord soldiers could hear the footsteps and shouts of the Lioncourt men, and were starting to become afraid, until Eustace told all of them to not lose their nerve, as they had the supposed clear advantage. He said that he was going to slaughter all deserters and told them to obey him and stand their ground to kill the others, else their only other option was to die. Both sides of the battle clashed with one another, and Varian tried to tell the enemy to move out of the way, but they did not seem as though they were going to move, so Rollo suggested that they would need to find another route. Unfortunately, Varian knew that they would lose if they gave the enemy time to think, but his thoughts were interrupted by someone leaping over one of the shields and trying to send an axe Varian's way. However, Yannick was luckily there to slice this man in half before he could get near Varian. The old man did even more by hacking at the other men that were in Varian's way, and the forces of the Bachelord were starting to falter, as they realized that Varian was not alone in their fiercity. Varian felt impressed at the sight of Yannick making his way through the masses of men, and knew that this truly was a knight who was hardened by battle. Yannick told Varian to go forth and catch his prey, while Yannick himself would follow soon. However, the older male was suddenly pierced in the chest by a spear. The enemy thought that he did something huge, but Yannick only raised his head with a grin and asked if that was all, before swiftly slicing the man in half. He laughed at the turn of events, and Varian was worried about the wound, but Yannick only wanted him to push forward, which Jean agreed for Varian to leave it to them. Yannick told the dark-haired male that old men always wanted to put on a brave front for the young, and with those words, Varian ran off while saying that he would return to collect the older male's bones, causing Yannick to laugh. He picked up his axe once again and stared at all of the Bachelord soldiers with a determined expression, telling them all to keep him company till nothing but bones remained. Varian and Rollo made their way to Eustace, and Rollo wondered if this was the right choice, to which Varian said that it was, since all their priority was to crush the enemy. As Varian got closer to the Viscount, he was stopped by the spears of the Bachelord soldiers, while Eustace laughed at the sight of the dark-haired male. He wanted Varian to stand there staring in fear while he would watch his men perish, but Varian wasn't going to do that, and kept pushing through the enemy forces. He threw his blade at the Viscount aimed at his head, but the horse took the hit for him and squealed in pain while its blood spilled out onto Eustace. Because the horse was thrashing around, he fell to the ground in the blood of the horse, but his men thought that it was his own blood, and yelled at everyone to retreat despite Eustace's weak efforts to get them to stop. Rollo praised Varian for his actions even if they weren't certain if the Bachelord was dead, but the forces were withdrawing, meaning that they had won. With this victory, it seemed that the relief made Varian collapse after fighting for days without rest. After that, the Lioncourt army plundered the Bachelord's lands before returning home, making this experience an unforgettable battle for Varian. The next day, Varian would awaken in the Porto City Hall with the battle having ended since the previous day. After fully recovering, Varian and the others were helping around with the other allies and making sure their injuries were dealt with. The dark-haired male held the right leg of this man, and Varian would tell Rollo and Tanqueray to hold down said male, while Varian would proceed to put the broken bone back into place. He then wrapped it around some wood and rope, telling the man that he would walk soon enough with the makeshift cast in place. Tanqueray was impressed to see Varian knowing so much about healing, before Jean walked in to ask if something was going on with Varian, since he was treating everyone despite only having just awakened. Varian assured that there was no ulterior motive, and asked for the items that he wanted brought to him, making the others, including Andre, feel a little exhausted from all the work they were doing at the moment. The dark-haired male was seemingly sewing someone's wound closed, and he knew that he had a lot to do for the others, since the world he was in now had no knowledge of science or even an understanding of the concept of bacteria. Jean and Rollo would watch as he would burn the needle and sew up the wound, telling the man to pull out the thread in a couple of weeks even if it would hurt. Everyone had been so grateful for Varian's treatment, and he was starting to feel as though he was leagues above those who called themselves doctors in that world. But he still had another role to fulfill, and that was to provide mercy to those who were too far gone to treat. He may have become used to ending lives, but his comrades' deaths were another story, and he felt guilty about doing it even if it was the right thing to do. Once he was done with doing so, Albert walked in, and Varian asked about Yannick. However, Albert said that Yannick had passed a short while before Varian awoke. This severely brought down the mood, as Albert explained it was the highest honor for them as old men to die as warriors, but Varian didn't know how to explain it to Jiro, Yannick's son. When Albert was there in Yannick's last moments, they chatted with each other and laughed, as Albert would give the male a drink as a toast for the afterlife. There was something that Albert wanted to ask Yannick and wondered what he thought about Varian's caliber, to which Yannick said that the answer would be better found from Roderick about Varian's military prowess. Albert explained that wasn't what he meant, and wanted to know what Yannick thought about Varian's worth to stand above all the others. Yannick's body shook a bit and said that he was a genius in plotting the course of war, along with possessing a brilliance that attracted others, making Yannick confident that Varian could become king. Albert started to laugh at the words coming out of his brother's mouth and even agreed, wanting to share another cup with the male, until he realized Yannick had dropped the cup onto the ground. With the darkness over Albert's face, he paused in silence, before deciding he would speak about a dream of his, regardless of whether Yannick was still listening or not. After leaving the post-war duties to his uncle, Varian made his way home and saw his mother, who ran up to hug the dark-haired male. He apologized about losing the sword and helmet she had given him, but she didn't care about those. Rusciano only cared about the fact that he was still alive. At that moment, he suddenly remembered a similar incident in his previous life when he was in a motorcycle incident, realizing that this is what it meant to be a mother. He died before his own mother on Earth, so he was going to make sure that Varian wouldn't walk the same path. News of their victory reached his father, who was excited at the news, but Varian's brother, Robert, didn't know if the report was accurate. Rudolph agreed that it was unexpected, but knew that the report from his own brother wouldn't be exaggerated. Their father continued to laugh about the situation while Robert would stand in the back, thinking about how his little brother had done so much in the battle. Even though he had been in battles himself, he felt as though his role was being a companion to their father, so he needed to rise. Albert felt fascinated by Varian and his exceptional skills, even being able to insult the old man to his face when he was only 9. He was convinced that the boy had a caliber to rival a man named Gwendol, who once subjugated the Lioncourt, or even stood equal to the great king Isidore, who took command of the kingdom of Armos after mastering all of Albert's teachings. He was going to let Varian rule after he defeated his father and brother to lead, chuckling at the thought, as Albert left the last of the alcohol for his brother to have, even if Yannick was long gone by that point. There was something that Varian remembered being told by Jiro about how the Lioncourt possessed black hair and black eyes, a point of pride for them. Jiro explained that an ancestor was an outsider who conquered the territory before striking a bargain in an effort to stave off the rebellions. That bargain being marrying into the family. Varian heard of political marriages before and knew it was a common strategy, but Jiro said that the marriage didn't cease just yet, until Varian's father was born. Why that was the case was because Rudolph's hair was the color black, making the Lioncourt people accept him as one of their own. So Varian believed that the people were relieved when their conquerors were defeated by genetics. Finally, Jiro told Varian about how his older brother Robert had tawny-colored hair while Varian's was black. So there was something that Varian learned about the difference that would impact Varian for the years to come. Everyone in the Lioncourt was still celebrating after the battle, and Andre was drunkenly exaggerating the battle that had occurred. Varian and Rollo sweat-dropped at the sight while they were in the midst of a party hosted by Smyrna's grandfather. But Varian was also deep in his cups as well and decided to join the storytelling, telling everyone about Andre's efforts. The kid who was there complimented Andre, who hesitated about his words, since it wasn't really the truth, and Smyrna chimed in to say that Varian was lying. He whipped his head around in surprise by her sudden presence, as the woman knew that her older brother was not that valiant. She leaned in front of the man and he suddenly felt something within him, causing Varian to grab the woman and tell her to go to the wheat field with him, which was their secret code to have fun with one another. When Varian entered the battlefield, he was prepared to never see Smyrna again, but luck was on his side to make him survive. Varian met with Rollo later that day and apologized for the wait, but that was no problem for the other male, as he knew it was natural for Varian to have his own kind of reunion with his lover. Rollo understood this greatly since he himself was going to meet with his own lover, Millet, the next day. Well, rather, her grandfather, which Rollo was almost hesitant at the idea of, since Millet's grandfather wanted him to marry into the family. Very few people in the country could read, write, and do basic math, so Rollo's value since he was still a slave made him a desirable asset. But Rollo wanted to continue supporting Varian. Varian knew that marrying would free Rollo from slavery, but he knew of Rollo's desires and had a plan, bringing 2 jars with him to the grandfather to discuss business about. The dark-haired male told the old man that there was sugar in the jars, something that was extremely high class for the people of that country. But it was true once it was tasted. Albin was shocked by the situation, as Varian said that it was created by alchemy since that was his only explanation, even though he just cut up the white beets and boiled them down. But he didn't want people badgering him about the making. He said for this to be kept confidential and said that he would sell it to Albin as long as he would let Rollo still be under Varian's command even if he got married. Albin explained that he felt hesitant with the lack of other children to take over the business, but Varian suggested that their first child could succeed the family trade, making the old man agree. They reached a deal and it was sold for a high price, something that Varian could renegotiate in the future but was glad that they could at least celebrate the marriage. Sometime before the marriage, the bachelor and his men were captured while Eustace was taken to the capital to pay a ransom that put him in debt. This caused him to tax his people to try and repay it, but that only caused his citizens to rebel and make him bankrupt. Varian knew that the problem could be traced back to the king and his younger brother, and he learned something important from this sibling quarrel. Those who revolt cannot be forgiven. Interrupting his thoughts, Varian met back up with his brother Robert, who wanted to learn about what happened in Varian's first battle. Varian thought that things would be fine as long as he wasn't greedy, as he wouldn't have anything to do with a succession struggle. There were deaths in the winter. First Yannick passed, and then it was Rudolph's mistress, Giselle, who was Hugh's mother. When Varian planned to attend the funeral, Robert said that they shouldn't do so for everyone since they were nobles. The dark-haired male was confused and explained that they were family, but Robert said that he would never consider himself related to the children of a freed slave. Robert's words reminded Varian of the harsh reality of the world as he went to see Hughes, seeing that Giselle had already been buried while people mourned. Varian learned that Hughes was going on a journey already, and the male wanted to leave Katya in Varian's care, to which Varian agreed to do, but he wondered why Hughes didn't just join their forces. This was followed by an answer that Hughes didn't want to follow Robert, but the male explained that things would be different if Varian succeeded the Lancour name. Varian didn't feel as though that was an option, and Hughes apologized, before leaving the territory with Albin's caravan. In the fortress city of Porto, Roderick praised Varian for being assigned as their chamberlain at age 14. He asked about the men behind him, and it was explained that they were people waiting to be his attendants. Varian was made the chamberlain after becoming popular, since Albert suggested that Varian would be in charge of the keep, and just have the job of crushing any enemies who attacked. Varian also did not have a head for politics, but Albert explained that Varian would just be maintaining the castle with tax funds. Eventually, Varian agreed, and Albert told the boy to learn well on how to manage people, grinning as he left. Roderick explained to Varian that there was more to being a chamberlain, starting to explain all the duties as Varian felt overwhelmed by it all despite agreeing to do it. He still aspired to follow in his uncle's footsteps, surprising the older male, as he understood why Varian would want that. Roderick too did the same, but he wanted Varian to know that he was much stronger than him, and had stirred the hearts of the people, something Roderick could never do. He quickly dismissed the topic and told Varian to pay his respects to Yannick's village and greet Jito on the way. But all Varian could think about was the words that his uncle had told him. Pushing that aside, he and Rollo went to Jito's village, and they were stopped by the guards, before Jito would eventually run out and hug Varian. They all greeted each other and were brought into the village to see everyone seemingly training, and Jito explained that it was because the village was a place of insurrection up until his father's generation. They were brought to the grave of Yannick, and were told about how their people prided themselves on simple funerary rites, and Varian could understand the feeling of wanting to keep the tradition. Varian and Rollo told Jito about how Yannick was outstanding in leading them to victory, while Jito started to cry, saying that his father told him about how he hoped the Lioncourt would be free from Armos's shackles. Varian looked away and said that he couldn't do anything as he was just the Count's son, but Jito insisted that Varian was indeed a true Lioncourt. As the snow fell around them, Jito's words weighed on Varian, as he knew that was what the people felt as well. He finally understood what his uncle was trying to tell him, but he thought it would be unthinkable to oppose his brother. As Hugh asked, Katya was now under the care of Varian, who was currently trying to get her to relax while he was doing something with her. The girl blushed and glanced away timidly, telling her half-brother to be gentle with her, to which the way they were both acting and speaking was honestly making the scene look a bit inappropriate. The dark-haired male grabbed a handful of the girl's hair and Varian told her she wouldn't feel a thing, but it seemed that he was wrong as she still gasped and flinched from the pain, as the male brushed the comb through her long hair. Katya blushed again and smiled softly at the care as Varian asked if it hurt, thinking about how he had invited Katya to live there in the castle with him only because Hugh asked him to, and he had no ulterior motives. At least he didn't think so. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to state that during this age, everyone in Armos had lice, so people would wash their hair with vegetable oil and comb carefully to get rid of them. Varian liked to do this kind of thing, especially since it would double the communication and bonding between them. But the male couldn't help but have to remind himself to make sure he wouldn't end up having weird feelings for the girl since they were half-related. Once Varian had left the room, he was greeted by a man named Poncello, the former commander of the castle's garrison. He was quite hostile to Varian at first because of his age, but he became cooperative once the boy showed his strength. Varian put a hand to his face at the information given about the bandits' campsite, telling Poncello to inform their men that they would subdue the bandits with the Brotherhood, an organization made up of Rollo, Jean, and Varian's retainers. The dark-haired male really wanted to call the organization Cobra Kai, but the suggestion was unanimously rejected. The snow fell from the sky as everyone trudged through the forest. Varian in his helmet as everyone prepared themselves for the battle with Rollo and Jean at his side. Bandits started to run away and flee, but Jean shot at one of them as the others got away, cursing to himself. This escape was only temporary for the bandit, as Varian dashed by the tree while the bandit was in mid-speech, not realizing the attack before it was too late. Within seconds, the bandit was slammed against and had his head smashed to pieces, the corpse flying off with blood spilling everywhere on the snow. Jean walked up and hummed at the fact that the bandit was already dealt with, but he grimaced at the bloody sight. The blonde looked at the iron mace that Varian had, mentioning that he wouldn't have to worry about breaking it, but he also mentioned how terrifying Varian's helm made him look, to which the dark-haired male explained that is exactly the reaction he wanted, as he was cursed as a monster and demon in their first battle, so now any enemies who wish to confront them should bare their fangs against the Lion Cours, and know a demon's retribution. These words said caused a shiver to course through everyone's bodies, and Varian thought about how the Bachelord's vassals were starving because of their plundering, leading to the Brotherhood honing their skills and gaining more combat experience. After a year and several months of working at the castle, Varian had turned 16 and married Smina, and he regretted all the attention that he drew to himself since the first battle, so they held a quiet ceremony, since Robert should be the one having more of the attention. When spring arrived, a war council commenced in the capital, and the order to eliminate Count Birgit was issued. Rudolf, Varian's father, asked about the Bachelord's movements, and the dark-haired boy explained that the Bachelord's recovery is unlikely, but mentioned that there's a possibility of them receiving aid from the king's younger brother. Albert agreed with the analysis, and suggested leaving behind contingent forces, to which Dekos, Rudolf's retainer, agreed, which made Rudolf hum and thought. This man had turned 40 this year while Robert had turned 21, and Varian felt like he had no objections to staying on the sidelines until this issue was settled. Unfortunately, Rudolf disagreed and said that Roderick would manage their affairs while they were away, while Varian would join, causing everyone to be shocked. Varian was worried about what would happen next, and Albert slammed a fist on the table, asking Rudolf if he had lost his mind, and wanted to make his sons compete. He stood up and stared at Rudolf while Roderick said that Robert had accomplished a lot and shouldn't be lacking much. Even Varian's uncle was coming to Robert's defense, so Varian was still confused about the refusal, not wanting to glance over at Robert. With a simple answer, Rudolf insisted that Robert was still his heir and wouldn't change, but Varian grit his teeth at the fact his father hadn't realized how much sentiment the people held toward him. Rudolf explained that they would limit their forces to 1,500 in order to keep some men at their home unit, telling Varian that he would command 500 men. The dark-haired boy asked if he was a decoy, to which his father affirmed so, asking Roderick what he thought, while Robert thought about how Rudolf didn't concern himself with the finer political subtleties, and wondered if Albert and Roderick didn't know. Robert knew that Rudolf didn't realize Robert's position as someone rejected by Lioncourt blood, wanting his father to understand that the people of Lioncourt would eventually revolt if they didn't approve of him. He turned to Varian, and wondered if he knew of the ramifications of their father's decision, thinking about how he needed to prove to everyone that he was also born a true Lioncourt. Black hair and black eyes were the features that made a Lioncourt. However, Robert had none of these. The boy stood inside a building and stared toward the light outside, hearing someone talk about how the insurrection was quelled, but how Robert's tawny hair might incite another dispute. The other asked if the color was proof of the grudge borne by Rudolf's ancestor, a curse wrought by a foreigner's blood. The two men turned around and were shocked when they realized Robert had been there the whole time, listening to their words. They became frantic about the fact that the boy had heard their words, asking how long he was standing there, to which Robert only held an empty gaze, while repeating back their words about this supposed curse, asking what that meant. The men tried to tell him to not take the words to heart, and that it was merely gossip. When it hit the year 917, Robert was there to see Varian born, except he had black eyes and black hair, which made him an official Lioncourt, both by blood and by appearance. Both of their parents were overjoyed, and the two sons were celebrated wholeheartedly. However, more than anyone else, Robert was delighted to have Varian as a little brother. They would be near each other at all times, and the baby would be on Robert's back while the tawny-haired boy would pretend to be at war while their parents watched with a smile, to which Rudolf said Robert would make a fine older brother. Back then, Robert wouldn't have minded if Varian was declared the successor, since he had the right hair and eye color, and Robert almost decided to bear the burden of this supposed curse, while Varian took on Rudolf's hopes. Varian was beloved by Robert, and everything seemed to be fine, until Varian became too eccentric and tyrannical, abusing slaves and finding sport in killing small animals, a foreigner's cursed blood. Robert would hear these words from other boys who would get Robert's attention and claim that his foreign blood was the curse driving the younger brother mad. But Robert was blunt, and refused that to be the case. The other boys were confused by this response and insisted that it was the case, and that their fathers had told them so, claiming the curse would someday destroy the Lioncours. The boy was about to suggest that Robert should kill Varian, but he was slapped before the words fully came out, causing the other boy to be appalled at the action as the blood dripped down his mouth. Robert stared down with a cold expression, telling the boy to choose his words carefully or else they would be the death of him. The boys froze up in shock from the intimidating aura, watching as Robert crouched down to the ground to look closely at the other boy. His face moved closer as Robert insisted that there was no curse, and that even if there were, it wouldn't have anything to do with Varian because he was going to carry that burden as his own. The boy felt something get caught in his throat, looking away as Robert put on a smile and told the boy to tell his father the same, and choose his words carefully in the future, as there wouldn't be a second chance. Later in Robert's life, the rainy season arrived, and Rudolph brought his mistress, Giselle, and Hugh to the family. Hugh was a very quiet boy, but the sight of Hugh made their mother collapse in tears, since there was only one reason for Rudolph to invite an unneeded illegitimate child to the family: to replace Varian. Rudolph tried to reassure Lucienne, but this was expected since Varian's savagery had gone too far. Hugh walked up to Robert and greeted him, telling the male to be at ease as he did not have the intentions Robert feared. The tawny-haired male wondered if Hugh was telling him that he knew his own place, hearing Hugh insist so, but it didn't seem to reassure Robert like Hugh wanted. Robert walked away in silence and into the rain, not wanting to accept nor acknowledge an existence that saddened his mother. Even despite Varian's behavior, Robert wanted to protect both Varian and his mother, but as the boy stood in the rain, that was when he heard the voice of someone calling for help. A guard ran up and explained it wasn't an attack, rather it was the fact that Varian had seemingly gone insane. Robert was confused about these words and ran over to the direction that the guard said the dark-haired boy was, telling the guard to inform Rudolph how he would run off. Apparently Varian had thrown a rock at a slave's child as a jest, and the child was injured, leading to Varian stabbing the slave protecting the child. This all seemed to have occurred at a bad time, happening on the same day an illegitimate child appeared, which worried Robert for what might happen. When Robert arrived, he saw the unfortunate sight while Varian had no sense of remorse in his eyes. The tawny-haired boy checked on the slave and his child, seeing that they were still breathing as he tried to carry them back, but Varian had no interest in helping a slave who should do all the work. Robert shouted at the boy and asked if he understood what he had done, making Varian huff and insist they were nothing but slaves, and they could always buy more. The tawny-haired boy started to cry and didn't know why Varian acted in such a way, causing Varian to cackle, but that was when Rudolph decided to take matters into his own hands, telling Robert to take his ease while their father stared at the dark-haired boy. In order to avoid blackening their reputation in the royal capital, Rudolph confined Varian at the estate. The first 3 days, the dark-haired boy bellowed continuously, hurling curses and reaching his hand out of the cell to grab at anyone who would come near, but after a week, he quieted. Even when Lucienne and Robert visited, Varian would only swear at them, and the boy showed no signs of repenting, leading to the situation deteriorating dramatically. The slave that Varian stabbed had died that day, so the boy's behavior could no longer be excused as just the antics of a child. Varian was confused as to who died, causing the two to be shocked as Varian thought it was a noble who died. Lucienne teared up and collapsed to the floor, believing it was her own actions that caused Varian to be like this. Robert explained it was the slave who died, but Varian didn't seem too sorry about the news and just laughed about it like it was nothing. The tawny-haired boy was shocked by the casual response, and wondered if the boy truly didn't see this was the reason he was jailed, and that somehow got through to the boy enough to confuse him. Later, Robert would sit at a tree, thinking about how their mother had confined herself to her room, which made Robert wonder what to do, remembering the curse that Kid mentioned before. Even so, Robert didn't believe such a curse existed, and didn't want to seek answers in the ethereal. He believed there was still something lying within the boy they could fix, especially since Robert didn't want to lose the only brother he had, wanting to live his life as his older brother. The next time Robert checked the cell, Varian wasn't there, but he was then told that Rudolph took him away for alleged sword practice, and didn't want anyone else to get in the way. Robert realized what was going on and immediately ran off frantically, confusing the male, as Robert hoped that Rudolph wasn't doing what he thought he was doing. Rudolph and Varian stood opposite from each other, and the boy asked what was going on, but the older male stood there in silence with his eyes closed, saying that he was thinking back on everything, and how he had never spoken in such a way before now. The boy still didn't have much of an alarmed expression, as his father mentioned that he had never seen a reason to separate Varian from Lucienne and oversee his education. but neither of the parents realized that pampering would lead to such an outcome. Rudolph tried to explain it was a parent's duty to discipline so they both could grow, but it didn't seem like the boy was listening, to which his father asked to hear the defense Varian had for killing the slave. Varian scoffed, saying he didn't know what the deal was. He didn't care, as he didn't believe he did anything wrong. Rudolph held a dark expression before raising the wooden sword and saying that he was relieved, smashing the weapon against Varian's head. The boy was sent to the ground, blood dripping from his head, as he stared with confusion at the way his father was acting. Varian tried to beg for his father to not kill him, instead to kill Robert for being cursed, but this only caused Rudolph to clench the weapon in anger at the fact that Varian thought nothing positive of his brother, who had worried over him like his own child. The boy was confused about why his words seemed wrong, claiming it was due to Robert that he was the one suffering. Those final words were the ones that caused Rudolph to deal the final blow, swinging the wooden sword at Varian's neck. A snap was heard, and the boy was thrown to the ground once again, without any movement coming from him, as he had broken his neck and likely died. Rudolph looked down with disappointment and anger, believing he should have entrusted Varian to Albert before he became so twisted, thinking that things might have been different. And that was when it happened. Clouds began to swirl around in the sky right above Rudolph and the dead boy who laid on the ground. They swirled and swirled around that very area until they seemed to descend from the sky and swirl directly around those two, before swirling just around the young boy. In just moments, it seemed as though the boy came back from the dead as his eyes shot open with a new sense of life, his body jolting on the ground as if something had struck it from the sky. Rudolph noticed the movement from both the boy's body and the force coming from the air, shocking him as he stared forward, his eyes glancing back at the young boy who now had his eyes with a new look in them. With some silence, his father finally spoke, and called out Varian's name in confusion. And that was the start of Varian's new identity. When Varian had his eyes shoot open, the dark-haired boy immediately got up from the ground, slowly trying to wake up and process everything that was happening around him. It seemed he was out of it, and still hadn't fully been in reality yet. But Rudolph didn't care too much for that and just stared in confusion, calling out to the boy while knowing he had definitely snapped Varian's neck. The male sweat dropped and gripped the handle of the weapon, gritting his teeth, before trying to swing the sword again. When the weapon came into contact with Varian's shoulder, a crack could be heard, as the boy was sent to the ground again. But it seemed as though he finally woke up from the trance he was in, finally in tune with the new body he was transferred to. The man in this new body frantically looked at the body with confusion, speaking in the language that he knew from the previous world, since that one was different than the language spoken in the current world. Rudolph didn't know at all what the boy was saying, and heard Varian continuing to speak in another language, while shocked that he was in the body of a child. However, Rudolph was still appalled by the situation, and wondered if this was a divine message. As the boy continued to speak in another language, Rudolph started to wonder if his son being revived was just punishment. The male called out likely to some higher being, feeling offended that they resurrected his child who he killed with his own hands, and thought that he wouldn't do the same again. Rudolph raised the weapon and was about to strike the child again, until Robert finally arrived in time, shoving his father out of the way, only to have the sword whack Varian in a way that wouldn't have killed him that time. The boy thudded to the ground while their father stood confused about the fact that Robert was there, to which the tawny-haired boy slid in front of Varian and shouted he had something to say. Rudolph stood there for a moment and decided to hear the boy out, seeing him outstretch his arms and saying that he knew what Rudolph was thinking. Robert swore to become the successor who fulfilled his expectations, and to use all of his effort to make this oath a reality, wishing to protect and cherish Varian and bear the responsibility for all of Varian's actions. Rudolph stood there again, while Robert had sweat dripping down his face before their father mentioned that Robert had originally considered giving up his place as successor, and now was risking everything for the boy. Robert was surprised that Rudolph noticed. Father asked if that would still be the case if his brother someday tried to kill him, to which Robert affirmed as so, and that was that. As the Brotherhood gathered with their men at the current day, Rudolph wondered how many times they had marched on Birgit, to which Robert said they should make it their last. The two grinned at each other until Varian walked up to them, wanting to discuss something, and that was about Varian being granted his own land. Rudolph and Robert were shocked into silence, while Varian knew that the request should express his intent to remove himself from the succession race. But they started to laugh, which made Varian frown at how the situation wasn't working out for him. Robert walked up to Varian and reached out a fist, to which the two brothers bumped fists while wishing for protection for the both of them. They hoped the other wouldn't let their guard down, and Varian was pushed off as Rudolph told the boy to make this an easy victory for them. The dark-haired male grinned before insisting they consider his proposal, causing Robert to huff. Rudolph asked if Robert still recalled a certain time, making the older brother wonder if the male doubted Varian. Rudolph said that Varian's unit was just a diversion, but the enemy could also attack from the rear, so it seemed as though this was all a test. The older male wanted Robert to know that entrusting one's own mind to his vassals was foolish, to which Robert reluctantly agreed. Albert asked Varian where he was going, to which Varian wanted to confirm the strategy with his father. The other men wanted to know if they would be rewarded or left to die, but Albert shut them up, as Varian thought about how Albert's real goal was to determine whether he was suited to being a commander. Andre walked into the area with a cart, to which Varian greeted the male and told Andre to tell him if there were any issues with the cart. There seemed to be something that the curly-haired male wanted to ask about, asking if Varian performed a good luck ritual with his sister. It seemed as though Varian agreed, and was even proud to have stripped Andre's sister and slipped the clothing inside his armor, walking off while Andre would think about doing the same when he would be married. Varian walked to his men and explained that Birgit and his men were the villains in this battle, and that they had the great hand of justice to not have to hold back, causing everyone to roar loudly as they hoped for victory. Roughly a fortnight had passed since the Brotherhood and their men had commenced their campaign against Count Birgit. Varian's decoy unit separated from the main force and south to destroy Birgit's smaller fortifications en route. There was a man on a horse who tried to seem intimidating to the men of Lioncourt, introducing himself as Leon de Doul. However, his head was immediately smashed by the force of the iron mace, as Varian sped past the commander on his own horse, seeing the male crash to the ground with blood and teeth spilling on the dirt and grass. Varian had a grin on his face and had a gleam in his eyes before raising the mace into the air, his horse jumping up to stand on its hind legs, while the dark-haired male in his helm told everyone to start the attack. After some time, the Brotherhood and everyone raised their cups as a toast to Varian's victory, cheering Varian's name. Albert was proud of the achievements the dark-haired male had been doing, but Varian wanted to ask if they should rejoin with the rest, to which Albert said was a difficult choice. Varian was about to choose to stay until Jean walked up, and agreed with the first suggestion, reminding Varian about the words that he himself had said during the time when they stole some pigs. Varian stood up and agreed with Jean, saying that they would merge with the main forces and head north. This seemed to make Albert grin, as the men in the room cheered in agreement, and Varian brought out the money he entrusted to the merchant to reward the men, exciting everyone as they started to line up for helms filled with coins. Varian wasn't going to begrudge his men their spoils, but he also knew that high morale meant that they would follow even when injured. Amidst the revelry, Rollo had a request to attach a horn to his helm, which Varian had no qualms about, but everyone seemed jealous about it, since this permission caused a precedent to attach horns to one's helmet when they have accomplished many deeds, making it a status symbol. Jean walked somewhere more private with Albert, who told him to live by Varian's side, which was already a given, confusing the blonde boy, until Albert explained that he was a warrior sent by God, and that he was the epitome of a cunning leader. Jean laughed and agreed with his grandfather until Albert insisted again, which made Jean smirk, and ask to even do so when Varian would go off to have fun with a captive woman. Albert had no hesitance to agree, saying that Varian's lust made him more heroic. As Varian had fun with this woman, she crawled up and asked if he had a family, to which the dark-haired male casually affirmed so. The woman started to cry about the awful things he was doing with her, while Varian thought about how he took a liking to the woman when he initially planned on selling her as a slave. He explained that he was only kind to his family, surprising the woman before she was pinned down. Varian told her to become part of his family and bear his child if she wanted kindness, but she didn't seem to want that. He slaughtered everyone this woman loved, and she wouldn't give her name no matter how much Varian would ask, so he wondered what he should do with her. The next day, everyone seemed to be outside their tents, and Varian was greeting his horse, to which the woman from last night asked if that horse was family as well. Varian said the horse was more of a comrade, and was named Noir, causing the woman to chuckle and ask for the male to give her a name as a slave. He was surprised by the request and the fact that her eyes were different than yesterday, seemingly determined to accomplish something. The dark-haired male decided on Belle, to which she agreed was fitting, since she was selling her body to survive. She rested her head on his chest and swore that she would bear his child and have that child kill him, as that would be her house's vengeance. Smiling at the male who walked up and leaned their faces together, he said that he liked the way she thought, and the two kissed right then and there. 5 days had passed since they left the fort, and Albert asked why Varian had been quite distracted since their departure, asking if it was about Belle. Varian tried to set that aside and asked when they would merge with the main force, but he was told to climb the hill and confirm their position. Suddenly it started to pour heavily, which meant that their supplies would be ruined, and enemies would have a chance to strike, since all they could hear was the rain. Everyone ran into the woods and waited for a while, but it finally let up, which made Varian hum to himself. However, now they could finally hear the sounds of stomping, which meant there were many enemies nearby. Everyone looking through the trees to see around 2,500 men. It seemed as though Birgit dispatched a couple thousand of men to divert their attention, but there was currently no chance of winning a fight when their forces totaled just 500 men. Their soldiers looked exhausted, and must have been forced to march through the torrential rain, along with the fact that the forest path had thinned the defense around their commanding officer. So Varian wondered if there was really a chance to do such a risky move. Jean spoke up and told Varian there was no reason to hesitate, explaining that the enemy finding them would be their end, so they should try to suppress as many of them as they could. The dark-haired male grinned at the response, and realized that he must have made Jean worry about him, making Varian ask for forgiveness for the dawdling. Those who waver die first in this world. That was what Varian was taught from day one, so fighting was going to be the only way he would survive. With that, he told everyone it was time to move. Jean was able to climb up into the trees without any of the enemies noticing, despite the subtle rustle of the leaves and branches. But the blonde male was able to prepare his weapon, drawing the arrow before it hit the leg of an enemy horse. The horse squealed and jumped up, jolting from the pain. Varian explained to everyone that the first step to their strategy was to have Jean aim at a horse with a rider who seemed like a noble, leading to the horse to start bucking, and drawing the attention of their ranks, which would be their moment. With that, the sound of stomping and running could be heard, leaves flying past the hundreds of men who came out from the trees with a battle cry, and Varian at the front. All the enemies were shocked at this since the ambush came out of nowhere, and the men of the enemy started to get their heads smashed in or their bodies slashed into, effectively having Varian and his men able to storm through the thousands of men that they were up against. One of the men shouted in surprise when he realized it was their enemy, seeing Varian crouch to the ground and raise a clenched fist, which was a signal for the archers to rise up from the bushes. Even more surprise filled the expressions of all of these men as they started to get shot at, and Varian stood up once again before telling all of his men to charge, to which everyone started to run at the enemy forces, while Varian told people to aim for the commander. Guerrilla warfare was a battle against time, but it seemed to be doing well, since the enemy panicked and their horses couldn't move in such a situation. Suddenly, the sound of a loud kick caught the attention of Varian, who recognized it as a powerful hoof, knowing only one man who would ride so expertly. That man was Albert, stomping forward on his steed before putting on his own helm. He laughed and raced past the enemies, stomping on them along the way, while Varian could only stare with bewilderment at the fact that Albert was galloping headlong into battle just by himself. Albert was definitely charming everyone on the battlefield, slashing against incoming men with his blade before looking back and telling Varian to conquer these men. The dark-haired male grinned and told everyone to press on, to which the men started to roar and continue their valiant efforts. Jean grinned at the sight and the fact that his grandfather had maybe a bit too much vigor, but it was thanks to him that the archers were now able to unleash hellfire to their heart's content. Arrows were raining from the sky left and right, as people were told to follow Varian by Rollo, who reassured everyone to not waver, as the enemy was starting to falter. The men that Birgit hired were definitely panicked and were confused about what was going on, wondering where Varian's men came from. Andre stabbed into one of them with a spear, and answered the question, saying they came from beside them. Another one of Varian's men charged forward and started to slice through the torsos of the enemy around him, but another told Tanqueray to pull back, or else he would be surrounded. Tanqueray insisted that he was Varian's shield, and that he would cleave a path for the dark-haired male, about to say more until a spear was plunged straight into his chest. The male was confused, starting to choke out blood, as more spears were plunged into his body while people would call out Tanqueray's name. The male would collapse to the floor and raise a hand, still insisting he was Varian's shield. He remembered how he told his mother he would be one of Varian's retainers to ease her burdens, but she admitted that she was still worried he would someday die in battle. As the male reached out, his hand was slashed in half by someone with more expensive-looking armor. The other male cursed at the man who killed Tanqueray, but it seemed Varian himself was even more enraged, dashing forward with a roar toward the noble-looking male who donned a shield and cape. The male was shocked by the action, and Varian used his iron mace to smash the shield, cracking through the tip of one of its corners. The enemy dashed back just barely, and the two men grunted to themselves or clicked their tongues before landing back on the muddy ground, which was wet with the rain that happened just moments ago. The male threw his shield away and recognized the mask of Varian, knowing that this was the demon of Lioncourt. But the dark-haired male was confused by the mention of his label, while asking that the proper etiquette stated a knight must announce himself first. The other male apologized and asked for forgiveness, although it was quite sarcastic, as the male introduced himself as Marcel de Gallio, claiming that he was the most skillful knight in Count Birgit's employ, and was otherwise known as Birgit's Morning Star. The roars of all the men around the area could be heard both at close distance and far away, the sounds of clashing weapons and grunts from those who would get hurt. Gallio introduced himself as Birgit's Morning Star, and felt proud of the title, his clothes flowing in the wind as Varian sweat-dropped by how bold the male was, before introducing himself back. Another man walked up to the noble-looking male and explained that the troops were in chaos, saying that there was no time for a one-on-one fight, but Gallio told the man, Vicent, that defeating Varian would mean that victory would be theirs. Vicent sweat-dropped and still insisted that Gallio shouldn't, as losing Gallio would mean death as well. However, that was when Gallio told Vicent that he would be there by his side in the battle. Before the male could respond, the two already charged at each other, clashing their blades together with a loud clang. The blade made a sound as it slid against the side of Varian's iron mace, to which Varian was able to notice it was quite a dull sword, making him feel amused, and wished that Gallio would do better than how he was at that moment. With a roar, Varian attempted to smash his mace toward the direction of Gallio, but the calm and confident male deflected it, and changed its path to be sent to the ground. Varian was confused by the fact that the blow should have shattered Gallio's sword and party, wondering how the male survived such a thing as that. The dark-haired male attempted to send another swing toward Gallio, who was already preparing for the attack, while Varian was thinking about swinging straight down, thinking that there would be no way this male could block one-handed. Unfortunately, Gallio did just that, blocking the attack, which surprised Varian, as the tan-skinned male attempted to swerve Varian's mace in another direction once again. The only expression on Gallio's face was just a grin, as Varian realized that this man was parrying his attacks, noticing that Gallio was tracking even the slightest motion with ease. Even after witnessing it with his own eyes, Varian underestimated Gallio's prowess, and it seemed as though Gallio was clearly well versed in combat and was a formidable enemy. Gallio was also one to notice how strong Varian was, but he still held up his confident energy, mentioning how Varian was more powerful than rumored, and that every strike was seemingly brimming with death. Varian sweat-dropped from the fancy words being thrown, and responded with a laugh, asking who taught Gallio his sword work. Gallio was quick to the point, and explained that he trained with his lifelong friend Vicent, saying that it was a style honed by powerless child soldiers to survive on the battlefield. Varian felt as though he couldn't afford to spend all his time solely on Gallio, because they'd staked their lives on this surprise attack, so he continued to swing his weapon, hoping that he would wear the guy down and break his focus. Gallio cursed inwardly, but still felt as though he could see right through Varian's attacks, wanting to pierce through Varian's weak spots. As the two went at it, Rollo and Andre wondered what they were watching. The battle continued and Rollo called out to Jean, who saw the situation and prepared an arrow, but Andre got worried and didn't want to intervene. Rollo explained that pride didn't mean dying for the sake of appearances. Rather, their pride lied in staying alive. Gallio's focus was bewildering, and Varian saw the male starting to close the gap, making the tan-skinned male find the opportunity and try to stab through Varian's face. Suddenly, an arrow went through Gallio's arm, causing the path of Gallio's sword to go off track, and only break through a part of Varian's helmet. The fact that Gallio missed made the tan-skinned male start to get frantic, as Varian prepared a counter. As Varian was about to swing, Vicent tackled Gallio to try to protect the male from the hit. It was still enough force to slightly get Gallio to cough up some blood, but the two were sent flying and crashing against a tree. Varian panted heavily and felt frustrated as he would have killed Gallio if it weren't for the other dark-haired male who interfered. Rollo asked if Varian was alright, to which Varian reassured Rollo until he turned his head at the sound of Gallio seemingly mourning his friend, who had definitely not been doing well from the force of the iron mace. Gallio shouted in confusion at the fact that his friend protected him, and Vicent choked out blood while explaining that there didn't need to be a reason, telling Gallio to retreat, as the battle was already decided. Vicent wanted Gallio to calm down, as he should focus on Birgit's safety, making Gallio tear up at the fact that his friend was always accepting of Gallio's shortcomings, all since they were young. His friend shakily reached out a hand that Gallio grabbed, as the male mentioned his vision was going dark, reminding Galio of the day they talked through the night with a starry sky. Vicente didn't want Galio to be defeated, and to not let the light of hope of Birgit's morning star die out, his arm falling to the ground as Galio sat there with an empty expression. Galio told all of his men to retreat like Vicente wanted, and that was how Varian's ambush achieved victory. But there was no joy in the triumph. There were over 80 casualties, and 4 of the Brotherhood died, but at least Tanqueray narrowly escaped death despite his condition remaining unstable. Varian did notice how clear and focused Galio's eyes still seemed to look, and he felt as though he would confront Galio one last time in the future. 2 days later, everyone combined with the main forces, and everyone had already been informed of their success. Back then, the dark-haired male was still unaware of something. Beneath the cheers celebrating their victory, there lay a seed of strife waiting to sprout. In another place, it seemed as though Galio brought Vicente's corpse back with him, and buried him into a cliff, placing his sword into the ground. Kneeling to the ground, the tan-skinned male wanted his friend to forgive him for leaving him behind at this cliff, but he did swear to Vicente and to himself that he was going to settle things with Varian, and return to the grave without fail. His men told Galio that they needed to hurry as their pursuers were closing in, causing Galio to stand up and hold a determined expression, as he was going to wager his life and soul on this vow, and cut Varian's head off to avenge him. Back at the Liancourt army's campsite, it seemed as though Robert found himself waking up after drinking a lot. He felt ashamed of the amount that he drank because this was the front line of battle, but his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of someone calling out Varian's name. That person was Albert, who was shocked by something that Varian said, the two standing a good distance away from the camp. However, Albert's voice was still loud enough to be heard. Robert was going to rescue Varian from a potential lecture this early in the day, but he started to overhear the conversation, as Albert told Varian to say what he said again. The dark-haired male insisted he had no interest in being the heir, and that their line would be safe in Robert's hands, so he was striking out on his own. Robert was surprised by the words as Albert felt angry at the response, telling Varian he had no choice but to succeed the Liancourt name, since everyone already loved the idea of that happening, and due to the fact that Robert would apparently kill him if he didn't. The two were left in silence before Varian huffed, and asked if Albert wanted to make him laugh, but that expression and word choice caused Robert to have a bad memory of the old Varian, causing Robert to start shaking and dash away in worry before throwing up next to a tree. Robert remembered their father saying that the one who entrusted his own mind to his vassals was a foolish one, making Robert hope that Varian didn't go back to his old roots. The dark-haired male continued speaking, and said that he was going to accept his fate if Robert wanted to kill him, shocking the old man, as Varian said Robert had strived to do the best for the sake of their people and family, so he was going to trust Robert's judgment if he deemed Varian a hindrance. Varian saw Robert as a Liancourt to him, and this perspective made Albert grit his teeth, screaming it to the air about the situation, while explaining it would be so easy for Varian to have everything he could ever want, yet he was offering his life so easily. Albert started calling Varian a withered old soldier, which wouldn't be too far off, as he was a middle-aged man on the inside. But his thoughts were interrupted by Albert asking what of Varian's followers who believed in him. Varian felt bad when thinking of them, considering his decision, but he was certain they would understand, making Albert scoff at the naive thinking. The old male calmed down for a moment and said that Varian had a good head on his shoulders, mentioning that was why Varian didn't understand something, before explaining that the people of Liancourt recognized blood and strength. He wondered if Varian was foolish enough to believe that they would trust words over power, asking if Varian thought he survived without walking the path of blood. Albert gave Varian one last chance to reconsider, walking away with a scowl, as Varian knew that he did understand his decision. If you want someone to listen, you first have to prove your mettle with a punch. Although their victory in the latest campaign was due to a bunch of lucky breaks, it was still too big a success to ignore, and that was why Varian needed to be more proactive, before more people would join Albert in his crusade to position the dark-haired male as the heir. Still, he needed to figure out what to do. 3 days later, the War Council on subjugating Count Birgit convened. Robert's father-in-law, Pirot, and Varian's cousin, Justin, both praised Varian for his achievements. Dekos was also there to mention how impressed he was, but Varian felt as though Albert exaggerated too much in the report, since he in fact didn't predict the weather patterns and such. But he couldn't deny the words as it would affect his men's reputation. Albert tried to overcompensate what had happened by claiming that he witnessed it, and Rudolph grinned at the words being said, while Robert held a serious expression before grinning as well. Varian laughed at the situation, and their father said that he wanted his son to reflect on this, beginning the War Council by saying that the castle was the last goal of their expedition. Birgit's military was barely 1,000, while they had around 2,500 together, but the castle was the problem itself, as it was well known for being impregnable. Robert explained that their past 2 campaigns ended in failed sieges due to their enemy having the higher ground, so everyone started to theorize what they could do. But Rudolph asked what Varian thought about it, which surprised him. The dark-haired male thought about it for a moment, humming and muttering to himself, but a lot of his thoughts were hesitant as there were many chances for mistakes. As his father and brother stared at him, that was when Varian immediately knew the answer, explaining that they didn't have to attack the castle, which surprised everyone in the room. Rudolph noticed the sudden idea, and Varian explained that they had done it before, making Albert smirk and ask if it was about the fire. Robert was surprised, and Rudolph asked if they were going to burn the villages, but Varian said that they were going to do more than that. Rather, they would corral them. Everyone was confused, but Robert understood that the burned houses meant everyone would take refuge in the castle, meaning the provisions would dwindle and everyone would starve. Rudolph felt a little bad for Birgit, but they were going to proceed with the plan. However, Robert wondered if this would stain the family name, making Robert think about whether Varian took into account of the fear that his actions would breed in the hearts of people. Robert promptly left the tent, while Varian would run after the tawny-haired male, calling after him and wanting to talk with his older brother. He was surprised before walking forward, his face close up, as he told Varian that speaking of a certain thing would give it life. Varian believed that Robert did know about the movement to back him as heir, so he wanted to at least reassure his brother that he had no intent to start a war of succession. With a clenched fist, Varian was about to speak until Robert interrupted him, asking if Varian remembered something from their past. In their youth, when they were traveling on the road back to the Lioncourt territory from the royal capital, they would always sacrifice sleep just to play a game called Reversey. The dark-haired male hummed in confusion and rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, before either remembering or playing it off, saying that Robert was obsessed with that game. Ever since those times, Robert had no other game captivate or delight him more than that one. Varian tried to agree, laughing it off, while mentioning how Robert was so much better than him. Robert explained that he had to be better, as that was all he wanted, to be better than Varian at a single thing. The dark-haired male sweat dropped and was confused for a moment, before Robert tried to claim that he was just joking, and was going to prove his worth through success, walking away while saying that he still had time. Varian felt as though he was not going to have a lot of chances left to talk with Robert, so he told his brother that they could play a game of Reversey before they would depart for the front, and that they should keep it a secret from their father. He claimed to have gotten better than Robert since then, causing Robert to sigh and agree to play that night. With a grin, Varian felt relieved that his brother agreed, and felt glad to talk to his brother alone. As the moon shone down on the campsite, Robert followed through and visited Varian's tent, where the male already had the board prepared. Robert, however, didn't have a smile on his face, as Varian wasn't able to notice the hand wrapping around his face. In a swift moment, Robert pulled out a dagger and stabbed through Varian's throat. The male coughed up blood and struggled, while Robert said that this day would come sooner or later, and that his family would have been forced to die with him if he lost, remembering how he swore to protect Lioncourt, which also included keeping it safe from Varian. If Robert and Varian went to war, their brethren would die for the cause, even if none of them hated each other. After that, their exhausted domains would be targeted by others, and they would both fall to ruin. Robert didn't want Varian to kill his own, so he was going to bear the dishonor and sin of killing his brother and have his child, Tristan, to redress the crime by taking Robert's head. Suddenly, that was when the tawny-haired male woke up in his tent, remembering everything in his dream, which made him tremble that he would even think of such a choice. However, it was interesting for him to feel such relief, despite knowing it was only a dream. He exited the tent and was greeted by someone who said that the preparations were complete, making it seem like he wouldn't be able to make it to the game that Varian asked about. As Varian waited there, he sighed in disappointment, and saw someone come into the tent to let him know about the marching orders. It was unfortunate, but they would have to leave the discussion for later, as he had to focus on defeating Count Birgit. Albert saw him leave the tent and wondered if Varian had told Robert and Rudolph yet about the decision, but Varian frowned and said that they would speak after, making Albert hum in thought with a frown, since it seemed that he really wanted to chat with Robert. Varian was always doing what he could to avoid a conflict with Robert, and he thought things would be fine as he strove to avoid that outcome, but his lack of conviction would later wrought tragedy. Robert seemed to be in a good mood, which surprised the male next to him, to which the tawny-haired male explained that he had a revelation in a dream, and felt he could rest easy. The male sweat dropped and felt glad for Robert, introducing himself as Jamal, and that he was part of Varian's brotherhood, before getting reassigned for the mission. With that, they started to march off, but Jamal had a grin at the fact that Robert saw him as unfamiliar. Someone else called out Jamal's name, and the male asked if it was time for a certain thing, hearing that their plan was about to be executed. Jamal started to grin evilly to himself and snickered, those words being exactly what he wanted to hear. When the first fire erupted, lights danced all across Birgit's domain. Thus, their march of death and destruction began. As the fire and smoke lit up the night air, people in the buildings started to frantically run around while screaming through the night. The sounds of hooves could be heard as a horse galloped through the town, while one of the civilians tried to defend himself with a farming tool. But he was no match for Varian, who rode through the streets while slicing people in half. He told everyone to not chase those who escaped, and to only kill those who would strike back, to which his men gave a battle roar, while Jean told people to throw the corpses in the wells and burn the crop fields. With the no counterattack from Birgit, flames engulfed the villages, and it seemed his army chose to keep an eye on the situation instead. Assured of victory, the Lion Corps pushed forward, while Varian was unaware of the secret ambitions lurking in the shadows. A man's flame was flickering quietly within him, one that would explode into a blaze and fuel an untold tragedy. In the deepest recesses of Robert's mind, the tawny-haired male wondered countless times about what would happen if Varian and him had opposite hair colors. What if they were born in reverse order? As the towns were being set aflame, the male turned around and saw a woman who was on fire, weakly begging for help. As the woman stared at Robert, it seemed as though he had a sort of illusion from all the exhaustion of the battle. Imagining this woman as his wife who was holding their burnt child, she called out to Robert and was crying, telling Robert that Tristan was dead, and the male was too disoriented by the illusion and called out Floria's name as he reached out to the burning body, which collapsed to the ground with a thud. Robert's mouth was left agape as he started to scream at the sight, his heart racing fast while he stared with fear. He started to laugh while looking up at the sky and at the moon, seemingly having snapped after that illusion. The male put a hand to his face, running it through his hair as he continued to chuckle wildly. Dekos stared with worry and a hint of fear, calling out Robert's name, which had no effect, as Robert reassured himself that he would protect Floria and Tristan without fail. In that moment, Robert got back on his horse and told his men to advance to the next village, ordering Dekos to lead the infantry. Dekos tried to explain that their unit only had 10 horsemen, but Robert only held a cold expression and a frown, before saying that the number wouldn't pose a problem, as he wanted to end this battle swiftly. The male, who was Rudolph's retainer, didn't know what Robert was saying, as it was quite ridiculous, but the tawny-haired male was already off in the distance, riding his horse. Dekos knew that the situation was not looking good, since Robert had lost sight of himself, so he needed to stop this as soon as possible. As the 10 horsemen rode through the forest, there were archers already waiting for them, and they jumped out of the trees to aim their bows and shoot their arrows, which killed a few people and injured the horse that Robert rode on. People were thrown off their horses, and Robert grunted at the arrow that plunged into his leg, jumping off the horse and telling everyone to dismount and raise their shields. He told everyone to focus on the enemy, but that was when Robert realized there were only 4 of them remaining. He was surprised by said number, as someone affirmed it was the case, making Robert curse under his breath about how careless he was, and not foreseeing this possibility. They were definitely similar to trapped rats, but Robert's thoughts were interrupted by another 2 people getting shot at and killed. The aim of these archers was frightening, so Robert told the others that they needed to find a way to the other side. They tried to sneak through the forest, until the last person by Robert's side was stabbed through the throat by someone lurking in the bushes, surprising Robert as he lunged forward and sliced through the arm and torso of this person. These people seemed to be more trained soldiers rather than peasants, so he wondered if information was leaked, or if they had traitors. Jamal creeped up behind Robert, which surprised the tawny-haired male, as he swung his sword, which made Jamal frantic, apologizing and explaining that he had a way back to their original location. The male took out his bow and Robert followed, walking ahead as Jamal smirked and aimed his bow. But that was when Robert asked how Jamal got this far. Jamal sweat-dropped and explained that it was by horse, but Robert hummed in thought, and reminded Jamal that there weren't any archers in the cavalry of their ambush unit. With a pause of silence, Jamal aimed his bow and tried to shoot, but Robert smacked the arrow away and charged forward, aiming his blade at Jamal's throat. The male grunted as Robert asked if he was part of Varian's plot, causing Jamal to be confused and shout in confusion, before asking if Robert really thought that. Jamal asked how they would even use a guy like Varian who cared more about his brother than his own life, admitting that they resorted to this measure since Varian refused to move against Robert. Robert told Jamal to stop, asking who ordered him. which made Jamal grin and ask if Robert was the one who changed after Varian hit his head. When Jamal would think back, Robert was always the one who believed in family above all else in the past, but now was different. This reminder made Robert drop his blade and tremble as he wondered when he changed. Jamal grinning wider as he told Robert that the people he should have protected were the very ones that drove him mad, as if he had been cursed. However, that was what Robert wished, that he would carry the burden of that curse as his own. Jamal chuckled and raised his arms, also reminding Robert that he told him when he was younger to choose his words carefully, or else they would be the death of him. With that, the male clenched his fist, and even more arrows shot at Robert's body, causing him to fall as the archers revealed themselves. Jamal said that Robert bored him, saying that he would kill both Varian and the rest of the Lioncourt family, claiming that he would be the one to break Robert's curse. As Jamal said these words, he started to cackle to himself, while the moon of the night shone down on everyone within the forest. In that moment, a mutter was heard coming from Robert's lips. He said in a weak but simple tone that there was no curse, making Jamal interject with confusion and furrowing his eyebrows. The bully from the past glared down at the tawny-haired male and asked if Robert really said something, chuckling, snickering before asking if Robert was actually begging for his life. That, however, was not the case, and Robert stopped coughing up blood, his lips tight together as he stared with an intense expression. Jamal paused for a moment and felt a vein pop on his face as he glared even more, and felt the intense aura coming from Robert's eyes, saying that he didn't like the energy coming from them. With that, he decided that he changed his mind and was going to take Robert's head home. With that, he decided that he changed his mind and that he was going to take Robert's head home. But these words made the archers confused, as one of them tried to recommend that he shouldn't go too far. Jamal not only told the archer to shut up, but he also told the archer to stop calling him by that fake name, explaining that his real name was Dominique Daumier. Robert was shocked that the male had been using a fake name, to which Jamal explained that was just how he survived so far. Jamal kneeled down next to Robert and told the tawny-haired male to remember his real name well, smirking while repeating it once again, trying to engrave it inside of Robert's head, claiming that was the name of the man who would kill him. Robert's face was smacked by the tip of Dominique's blade, confidence lacing his tone, while claiming that Robert had gotten carried away. He called Robert a half-breed, and asked who was the eldest son of the Lioncourt family. Dominique told Robert to apologize to all the people of Lioncourt, as there was supposedly filth in his blood, swinging at Robert's body with his bow, while the other archers stared with hesitance and almost pity, considering the side they were currently on. Robert laid on the ground on his back as Dominique walked over to stand over him, putting a hand on his chin, while mentioning that he had thought of something good. He mentioned Robert's wife, Floria, and said that he would keep Robert's severed head in his hands while he would copulate with the woman, claiming this was his mercy, and that Floria would supposedly be happy as well. Dominique also claimed he would let Robert and Floria have his child as a purebred Lioncourt, but all of these words made Robert enraged, as the tawny-haired male grabbed his blade and swung at Dominique, who dodged the attack with a confident grin. The male was about to mention that it was easy to dodge if one knew how to avoid it, but his words were interrupted by the feeling of his fingers getting sliced off. Dominique started to scream in pain from his fingers being sliced, and he cursed to himself while Robert stood there, his body still slightly trembling, but that didn't matter, since there was a rage in his eyes. The curly-haired male ordered the archers to kill Robert, but that was when Robert threw something at some of the archers, which paused their attack, as Robert dashed forward and sliced at some of them, making his way to Dominique, who was confused by the progress that Robert was making. Even with his sliced-off fingers, Dominique still tried to shoot at Robert, to which Robert blocked it again, and threw away his sword before grabbing the male by the throat, slamming him against a tree. Dominique continued to laugh despite the confusion about this sudden power. However, Robert took out a dagger and aimed it at Dominique's heart. As it stabbed through, he tried to tell the archers to hurry and kill the male, but that was when Robert told everyone to put their arrows away, shocking them, as he explained that he would already die soon, and that this man wasn't worth sacrificing any more of their men. They seemed to listen, which confused Dominique, who grunted in pain from the blade stabbing even more through him. Robert internally asked for forgiveness from his wife for not being able to watch over his son, telling Dominique that he understood the fear, and that it was easiest to blame others for one's own fears. The tawny-haired male hoped that his family would be able to face the difficulties ahead, and that there was only one thing he could do now, explaining to Dominique that there wouldn't be a second time of him going against his ideals. After Dominique died, Robert collapsed to his knees and coughed up blood again, glancing at and telling the archers to swear to him as they took his head. He wanted them to devote their lives to Varian and become a shield against the enemy, declaring that Varian was truly a Lioncourt, and that he would become the king of Armoros. He grinned with sincerity at the idea and laid on the ground again, remembering that he couldn't keep his promise about playing Reversi with Varian, grinning as he believed that it would leave him as a winner at the game. At the Birgit castle, it began to rain shortly after dawn, and the damage was more than enough, while everyone made their way home in high spirits. However, that happiness wouldn't last long, as Varian would eventually stumble upon everyone crowding around a tent as a cloud of despair and sadness filled the air. He was able to notice that it was a funeral being held, and the dark-haired male was confused at the scene, his eyes widening at the fact that in the coffin lay his own brother, which confused him greatly. Varian pushed through everyone and started to shout, tears falling down his face as he trembled and reached out to Robert's face with confusion. He wondered who had done this to Robert, before Dekos walked up and said that archers did this, explaining that Robert took the cavalry in front and was ambushed on the pass in the forest. Varian was surprised before realizing there had been traitors in their midst, and this was an assassination, making him cry even more as he believed that this was his own fault. The dark-haired male apologized for still being naive, and not having the guts to fight with his own brother, saying that he shouldn't have tried to avoid familial conflict, and that their uncle was admirable for living his life without disobeying his older brother, without showing much ability or ambition. There had to have been someone next to Robert, someone who wanted to support Varian and could know the route of the march. A familiar face flashed through Varian's mind, and there was no need to think about it, knowing that there was only one suspect. But there wasn't enough evidence to question Albert. The dark-haired male clenched his fist while sitting on his knees next to Robert's coffin, swallowing his uncontrollable anger as he greeted that very male that morning. The next day, an army came out from the Birgit castle, and the number of soldiers was approximately 400. As Varian stood with his own men atop of his horse, he had a new helm of the previous design, thinking about how it wasn't the whole army as he expected. He wondered if there was an internal dispute in the castle, believing that this meant that Count Birgit was unable to command his army. The person whom Varian's father Rudolf was having a war of words with was not Count Birgit, so Varian wondered if this was a general of the warring faction. Regardless, the dark-haired male had his eyes on a certain familiar face behind the person that Rudolf was talking to. This person was Galio, who was lying in wait, his eyes holding an intense glare as Varian's sweat dropped and grinned, knowing that he couldn't let his guard down, and that he clearly saw he must kill this tan-skinned male. The sound of hooves was heard as Albert rode up to Varian, saying that Count Birgit was just a coward, but Varian didn't respond, as every time he looked at Albert's face made him feel like he would say something irreparable. An awkward silence filled the air, as the two were next to each other, to which Varian didn't even want to glance at the older male. But Albert continued his words. He explained that the past Lioncourt territory was weak, and was only prone to repeated civil wars. This made the dark-haired male finally take a glance at Albert, who said that he had served the Lioncourt since the previous generations, and that every time there was a rebellion, he had to kill some of the people of Lioncourt day and night. Eventually, Albert was dubbed the Lioncourt Slayer, and people started to come for his head. So Varian wondered if Albert was trying to make excuses for killing his brother. Albert knew that Varian wouldn't believe him, but the old male said that he didn't like killing, and that he only did so because he believed it would lead to the unification of Lioncourt. However, it was not this path that led to the end of civil wars. It was a Lioncourt with black hair and black eyes, that person being Rudolf who took over. It wasn't anything else. It was the blood that made people obey. Albert glanced to Varian, telling him that he should take over if he truly valued Lioncourt, and that the Lioncourt of today was poor and weak. If the dark-haired male made even the slightest mistake, he would perish, and that Robert's ability was not enough, even if he could rule Lioncourt with it. The male gestured toward everything, and claimed that Varian was the only one who could lead the people of Lioncourt, wanting Varian to become strong enough to defeat all disasters. He wanted Varian to spread their blood, and this speech made everyone silent with bewilderment as he continued, saying that he would draw the curtain of fratricide. With that, he charged forward, which confused everyone greatly. Varian wondered if he was going to die and take responsibility for Robert's death, but the dark-haired male wasn't going to let the old male die like this. Varian told everyone to follow Albert, and that was when everyone started to charge forward despite Rudolf's confusion. They were in the middle of a war of words, but it couldn't be helped. All that was on Varian's mind was to catch up to Albert, watching as the male would stab through some of the enemy men who were confused and thought he was crazy. Albert called everyone weak, and he had his horse jump in the air as the enemy men tried to surround him, but they were seeming to have trouble. The male thought about how he had a good life, and had learned the art of killing to survive, being dragged off his horse while he remembered realizing the worthlessness of people when killing them. Albert would always go through every day while wondering about what made people human, or what made them valuable, so he would always ask himself these questions and come back to the same answer. As multiple spears stabbed through his body, Albert dropped his blade, and knew that killing was the pride of his family, and all that he was valuable for. But it wasn't worth it. The answer that Albert had was Varian, glancing at the dark-haired male who ran toward Albert's bloody form, telling the enemy to come and kill him instead of Albert, as one of the enemy men raised his blade over, ready to slice through and deal the final blow to Albert. Varian begged for them to take his head and face him, but it was already too late. In that moment, Albert looked over and gave a simple grin toward Varian's direction, muttering to tell Varian to look after his grandson. That was when Albert found the meaning of his birth at the end of his path, praying to whatever god there was as Varian witnessed Albert's head get cut clean off. Albert never believed in God, but he praised it for this chance encounter. In the last moments that Albert had any sense of consciousness, he saw Varian call out his name, while Albert would think about how the boy had done a great job, and how Albert himself had lived a good life. The field battle against Count Birgit's forces started with a surprise attack due to Albert's charge, making Varian believe it would be a one-sided massacre. However, Marcel de Galio, the Morning Star of Birgit, took charge and saved them from annihilation. To honor his prowess on the battlefield, Delorme halted pursuit, to which his pride and chivalry wasted Albert's death. Back at the Linecourt army camp, Rudolph was in a tent, humming and thought about the fact that some of Birgit's men had seemingly come to negotiate for peace. The men were staring intensely while sweating from the thick tension in the air, explaining that Count Bernard de Birgit would appear before the king and would be taken as His Majesty's prisoner, so the male wanted to offer some terms as ground for a peace agreement. Varian's father paused for a moment and stood up, stepping toward the male whose body was now trembling from the commander-in-chief being so close. He was worried that Rudolph was going to kill him, sweating even more, until Rudolph said that it was a great idea, which caused the man to have some hope and raise his head. Before he could process what was going on, Rudolph had already pulled out his blade and stabbed it through the man's head. The messenger was pinned to the ground by the blade as Rudolph glared, saying that peace agreements were not worth talking about. When the blade was pulled away and Rudolph turned his head over to the two other messengers, they were shocked and were trying to scoot away from the dead corpse of their comrade. They were trembling and sweating in fear as one pointed, asking how Rudolph had the audacity to kill a messenger of peace, despite the common etiquette of war. Rudolph narrowed his eyes, and Varian walked up to stand next to his father, asking what they should do with the remaining messengers. The last two were surprised when they heard such words, seeing Rudolph stare at them with a serious expression, until he suggested that sending just one back to Birgit should be enough. He gestured to the bearded one, saying to kill him and break his corpse on the wheel before displaying it publicly. The male tried to recommend that he shouldn't do such a thing, as barbarism would only tarnish the Linecourt name, begging to just do something else instead of dying. But the decision was already made, and his corpse was thrown on a wheel. Varian rubbed his hands together and stared at the multiple corpses either on wheels or on stakes throughout the area. Under these war conditions, there was no point to their actions, so the killing was just him and his father trying to vent their sadness over the loss of Robert. Someone walked up to Varian, mentioning that Birgit was on the march, which made the dark-haired male think that Birgit made up his mind. However, they were able to see that Galio had rode forward all by himself. Everyone was confused by this action, since Birgit no longer had the will or power to fight, so they wondered if this male would stay loyal. The tan-skinned male introduced himself once again, and explained that for the sake of his lord, pride, and in honor of his friend, he wanted to settle the war with a duel with Varian. Varian stared forward with a serious expression, ignoring the laughing in the background, as he knew that Galio was still stuck on his friend's death. The dark-haired male glanced over at Rudolph, worried about what would happen to his father if he died in the battle as well. Rudolph paused for a moment before recognizing Galio's act of choosing to die with honor, something that Robert couldn't do. Varian agreed and decided he would accept the battle as that was the etiquette of war. His father agreed, and everyone on the side of Linecourt started to cheer for Varian. The male got on his horse as Rollo gave Varian a specific item they recovered, going back to the crowd while wishing Varian luck. Varian apologized for the delay, but Galio wanted to thank Varian for agreeing to the duel. The dark-haired male grinned, saying he didn't mind, but Galio admitted that he didn't have any regrets in his heart anymore, and wanted to thank Varian for coming to kill him. Even despite those words, it seemed as though something was burning within Galio as his horse charged forward. Varian was surprised by the sudden action, barely dodging the spear that plunged through his cloak. He tried to get away, still bewildered that this man who made such a sorry face had so much killing intent in his attacks. As the two clashed spears together, Varian saw the weapon start to spin, surprising Varian at the skill even on horseback, as Galio threw Varian off his horse. He collapsed to the ground as Rollo called out with worry, hearing Galio ask if they should end the battle. Andrew and Jean wondered if they needed to join, but Rudolph spoke up and told everyone to watch, as this was a man who couldn't afford to play around, and was a person to carry their land and people. He was the next lord of the Lioncourt family. Galio continued to send the spear toward Varian's way, while everyone would stare with bewilderment and worry, as the dark-haired male would try to block all the attacks, feeling frantic since he couldn't close the distance. The tan-skinned male had an intense look as he continued the flurry, eventually starting to push back Varian, which Rollo noticed. Suddenly, it seemed as though something was sent off Varian's shoulder by Galio's attack, making everyone worried when they saw the male collapse to the ground. But it wasn't a decapitated head, it was just his helmet. Even so, the spear still grazed Varian's head, making blood drop onto the ground as Varian lifted his head again, while his comrades would cheer about how he was still alive. Intimidating silence consumed the air before Varian got back up, and asked if Galio was chosen by the goddess, to which the tan-skinned male confirmed that was the case, and saying that they were both chosen by the goddess. Varian grinned, and said that due to that fact, there should be no need to hold back. Galio agreed and claimed that Varian's life was at risk, but the expression on the dark-haired male didn't falter, as he kept a grin before already having his next move planned in advance, all during their exchange of words. With that, Varian put his index and thumb between his teeth and whistled loudly, surprising Galio, before he and his horse were tackled by Varian's horse. The male was shocked that such a situation was able to occur, but he was thrown off his horse, which had also flipped over and collapsed to the ground from the force. The tan-skinned male was barely able to land without much injury, getting up on his feet while cursing under his breath, since the fight was about to conclude until that happened. Varian seemed to have made his way behind Galio before the male could realize, saying no to what the male said, and explaining that the fight was only just getting started. Varian held the blade high and loomed over the tan-skinned male, swinging the blade, clashing against Galio's own blade. The dark-haired male was starting to get angry at the fact that Galio could still react, blocking all attacks from Varian, but Varian was going to keep pushing before Galio could regain his strength. Fortunately, it seemed like things were leaning toward Varian's side, as Galio realized he was running low on stamina. Because of that, Galio was starting to get pushed back, which made Jean excited. However, Rudolph believed that his son would lose at this rate, which confused the others. Rudolph explained that Galio wasn't ordinary, and had extraordinary skill, so this all pointed to Galio having experience ever since he was a child, and had natural abilities and eyes that made it possible. This was a man who could analyze movement in battle, and utilize all weapons needed for a battle, but in terms of physical ability, Varian was better. However, there was still a difference in skill, since Galio had that experience on the battlefield. The two clashed blades, and Varian asked why the tan-skinned male's breathing had gotten heavy, but it seemed as though Varian was getting sloppy as well. Another clash of their weapons, and Varian said that the male couldn't win if all he did was defend. With that, the tan-skinned male asked if Varian thought his true strength was defense. Before Varian could process his confusion, Galio had already slashed through Varian's chest, as Galio agreed with Varian's words. The grip on Galio's blade tightened, as he hoped Varian could feel his friends resent, sending another slash to Varian's body. More and more slashes started to make everyone worried, while Varian himself would be shocked by the speed and stamina still left. But the situation got worse when the blade was thrown out of his hands. Galio was about to give the final blow until Varian had one last weapon on him, taking it out as the tension of the situation got thicker. With just a short dagger, he was able to stop Galio's blade, but that was when the tan-skinned male recognized the dagger. That dagger had originally belonged to his late friend Vicente, causing Galio to get confused and emotional, asking why Varian had such an item. That was when Varian pulled Galio closer, asking if that was important, but Galio was more focused on getting the dagger back, With that, the dark-haired male dropped the blade as Galio tried to give it back, giving Varian the opportunity to settle the battle. Varian asked if Galio knew what judo was, not giving him the chance to answer before Varian used a martial arts move that he learned from his previous life, as he threw Galio to the ground with a strong force. In the past, the dagger that Vicent owned was one he used as a memento of Vicent's own father. Galio and Vicent sat by the fire as the dark-haired boy explained that his father died on the battlefield, and that the dagger was the only thing left behind, to which Galio explained that he was jealous of such a thing, since he had nothing to remember his own history. He believed that he had the blood of the mountain tribes due to his appearance, but he knew nothing about his family or past, making Vicent feel bad for the boy, as Vicent offered to be considered family to Galio. With a soft smile, Galio thanked Vicent, and claimed that he would become a worthy big brother, to which Vicent said wouldn't be the case because he was the taller one. These memories, including the last expression Vicent had in death, were playing through Galio's mind, as he was being thrown to the ground, slamming into the dirt, with enough force to cause him to cough up blood. Varian stared at the male as he believed that he heard the sound of bones breaking, knowing that he wouldn't be surprised if Galio was already dead. With that, everyone including Varian believed that he had won, cheering loudly as Rudolph grinned. But his father realized and told his son the battle wasn't over yet. Galio had seemingly gotten back up and grabbed his blade, standing there without a word, as Varian was in disbelief, since he heard enough bones breaking in Galio's body that it would make it hard to fight or stand. So Varian wondered if this was out of spite or pride, and how far Galio would go just to kill Varian. The hands holding Galio's blade were trembling, as he muttered something entrusted to him, mentioning this land's future. Varian was confused by the words, wondering if this wasn't about revenge. Galio did want revenge, but that was a personal grudge, since he knew that Vicent wouldn't come back. So Varian asked what drove this man. With that, the tan-skinned male explained it was the future that drove him, remembering that his friend told Galio he was the hope of the land. It all started to click in Varian's mind, as Galio said that the living must show these things, explaining that a wish entrusted to him by the dead that this land's soldiers and even children were looking toward the future, and were the things that Galio was carrying on his back. Varian was surprised by how this man was still pushing his ideals despite being a dead man, and Jean was confused until Rudolph explained that Galio was going to risk his life to protect his territory from true defeat. Rollo asked what true defeat meant, and Varian's father mentioned how Birgit had lost soldiers already and were already in trouble, so everyone fell into despair, which was when Galio rode out on his own, likely wanting to keep his people hoping. Even so, if Galio won against Varian, they would still just kill Galio. Jean was told that it would be better understood from the perspective of the other side, and Rudolph continued, explaining the story in simple terms. Birgit was forced into a corner and tried to fight back with a cowardly plan which failed, but a young man rode out to challenge the enemy with just one horse, only to be tragically killed and have his spirit become the pride of the land. Birgit's morning star, the hero Marcel de Galio. With that, everyone was able to realize that Birgit surrendering didn't mean the people would bow down, meaning governing would be difficult from now on. Even if they were the enemy, they should keep in mind that when you govern people, do what you say. The two exhausted men stood opposite from each other and grinned, before preparing their blades once again, as Varian remembered how he was also entrusted with a similar thing as Galio, knowing the experience of the living expressing the will of the dead. Varian charged forward, remembering Albert's ambition, his brother's dissatisfaction, all those who died in battle, and everyone's wishes. With that, the force of Varian's attack was enough to smash through Galio's sword, and give the final blow to the tan-skinned male. Galio dropped his blade and stared at the sky, reaching out as he hoped his friend was in the afterlife and smiling at him, despite failing to take revenge. While collapsing to the ground, he knew he lost the battle, and would be able to talk again with his friend. Everyone started to cheer loudly, and later Count Birgit had been broken by the defeat of Galio and surrendered with no conditions. He was taken to the capital while the Birgits were taken prisoner, and the soldiers and people who were holed up were sold as slaves. This battle later came to be known as the Birgit Tragedy, the story claiming that a foolish lord invited the devil and caused the death of the hero. Varian had lost his brother and mentor, causing a determination to light a flame in him, as he wondered about what to do to not lose any more people. To lead Lioncourt. That was likely the reason he survived and was born into this world. When everyone returned, they would normally report to the king, but a messenger had already been sent, and they would have an audience with the king at a later date. This was not a triumphant return, since everyone was still in mourning of Robert. Varian and Rollo made their way to a humble home that was owned by Tanqueray and his mother, to which they were proud of how the male survived. Tanqueray claimed that his dead father scolded him and said it was still too early to die, so Varian decided to praise the male even more for how he survived despite the holes in his body. The male with the buzz cut said that there was not much he could do anymore with his disabilities, but Varian claimed that Tanqueray should try to learn arithmetic before having such an attitude, to which Tanqueray felt was too difficult. Even if the male was hesitant, Varian ordered the male to work for him until he died, causing Tanqueray to start crying, since he was originally worried about no longer being part of the Brotherhood. That night, Robert's funeral was held, and thousands of people came, to which Rudolph thanked them all for gathering to honor those who fell. He mentioned that Robert was one who also died, but the funeral was also for everyone's husbands and sons to be mourned together. Someone pulled at Varian's clothing, confusing him, until he realized it was his brother's son. He started to talk with Tristan, wondering where his mother was, until his hand was slapped away. Varian winced from the action until he realized it was Floria who had an intense glare, likely thinking that he killed Robert, since everyone in the war knew that the only person who would benefit from Robert's assassination was Varian. The male was called up by his father, and he ran a hand through his hair before moving past his father, who told him to take hold of the situation. With that, the dark-haired male knew what to do, wanting to show everyone that he was indeed the successor of this man. Varian started off his speech by mentioning how he had been told he was an unruly child, and that Robert was the one who cared for and supported him, being guided by Robert until he no longer could. So all Varian could do from now on was repay Robert, knowing that he didn't want Robert's child to carry this burden. The dark-haired male announced that he would inherit his brother's wishes, hoping everyone would watch his back. Cheers erupted from the crowd, even if Varian knew that his words could only go so far. At a later time and day, Varian was following Jean through the forest, which confused him, until the blonde boy teased Varian, and said that it was okay to go home if he was scared. But Varian was just worried about Rollo. They eventually arrived at the grave, which was in a private area due to how Jean's family traditions were, and Varian kneeled to Albert's grave before pouring alcohol on it. The dark-haired male wanted Albert to know that things went as Albert planned, but he still couldn't forgive Albert, even if it was originally his fault that everything happened due to his attitude. When Varian prayed, Rollo and Jean were confused, but Varian continued and hoped Albert would watch as Varian would walk the path of leading Lioncourt. The story of heroes continued, and everyone would go through their lives, having many more battles and growing older with each day. Great kings were passed down, and thousands of soldiers would follow, fighting alongside a king who established a new kingdom. Speak the name of their country, speak the name of their king. In the year 948, Varian defeated someone who was sent by the king's brother, and after conquering the Bachelored territory, the establishment of the Kingdom of Lioncourt was declared. Varian made peace with Count d'Armont, who collaborated with Viscount Bachelored, and established Varian's kingdom. With the death of King Jamal, the era of the Great Armos Kingdom came to an end, and it was the beginning of an era in which independent countries ruled over their territory. Fate moved the stars that would revolve around the Great King. Some would suffer, some would die, some would love, and all those encounters would weave the story of a great king. Here is the first step of a great king and the end of this story.